It's Thursday the 17th of November. This is a Politics Live special as the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt prepares to announce massive spending cuts and tax rises in his autumn statement. Joining me for this Politics Live Autumn Statement Special, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young, the Economics Editor, Faisal Islam, and Business Editor, Simon Jack. Today...
Who's responsible for this mess, Mr Hunt?
The Chancellor will say that Britain must face into the storm as he seeks to restore Britain's tarnished economic reputation with a big package of tax rises and spending cuts. It all comes amidst a cost of living crisis.
I'm very concerned because we're now entering the winter months when heating costs rise.
I think the biggest worry at the moment is the heating cost, the fuel cost.
We'll have the statement in full at around 11:30, full analysis. Plus, we'll be hearing from both the government and Labour. Welcome to this special programme. A big moment for the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. He left number 11 Downing Street just a short while ago. You'll see here he's carrying that green folder, not the big red box, because this is not a full budget, but it is still critically important, this autumn statement. It will also come alongside figures from the independent Office for Budget Responsibility. You'll remember they weren't there when Kwasi Kwarteng stood up on the 23rd of September to deliver his ill-fated mini-budget. Jeremy Hunt making his way to the House of Commons. We're expecting him to stand up in around 25 minutes' time. He's only been Chancellor since the 14th of October. He was brought in at a moment of political and, to some extent, economic crisis when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak, who took over, has kept him on, and he has talked about Jeremy Hunt, eye-watering decisions, horrible decisions, he says, that will be made, but, he said, with compassion at its heart. We will, of course, judge all of that when he stands up and delivers his statement. Vicki Young, give us some of the political context to this. We've had 3 Prime Ministers this year, 4 Chancellors. Jeremy Hunt has softened us up to some extent for what he is about to announce today. There are political reasons for that too. But why are we here at this particular point?
I mean, I think it's worth going back, even further than that last mini-budget. If you go back to a year ago when Rishi Sunak stood up and gave the autumn statement, he was promising investment is growing, public services are improving, the public finances are stabilising, the UK is recovering faster than our major competitors. Now, of course, global issues, the war, an energy crisis, but the UK had another dimension. We had political turmoil. You think about the fact that, of course, there's extraordinary turnover of prime ministers and ministers, Boris Johnson being ousted, ministers changing, incredibly quickly. So it meant that decisions maybe weren't being made over the summer. And then that moment when it was supposed to be everything is clear, there's a moment of stability and clarity, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng unleashed their economic plan, and it was jaw-dropping and then caused utter turmoil and then another lot of turnover. So now Jeremy Hunt is the man who has to restore the reputation of the country for economic stability and, of course, for his own party, something that the Conservatives really do prize, don't they? He's got to keep markets happy, he's got to keep voters happy, and he's got to keep his backbenchers happy.
I mean, we were all sitting here not that long ago, on the 23rd of September. The market turmoil that Vicki has just talked about, you were monitoring it as it was happening pretty shortly after Kwasi Kwarteng had stood there and delivered that plan for growth. What is driving the decisions that Jeremy Hunt with Rishi Sunak have already decided to do and they're going to unveil today? How much of it is about that event that we covered not so long ago, and how much of it we would have had to have done anyway?
I kind of see this as a sort of rescue budget, and part of the rhetoric that Vicki has mentioned has been about overturning what is acknowledged by both current inhabitants of Downing Street as being the mistake of the mini-budget. But I think that they want to step back and say the bigger thing that they're dealing with in terms of the economy is in fact a massive energy shock. So it's both of those things, and it's usually weighted towards the energy shock. An energy shock that means that the national energy bill is now about 8% of the worth of our economy, about 190 billion. It's normally, 2019, 2%, quadrupled. That difference is worth the value of our spending on the NHS, right? And that carve up of who pays the bill won't all be the government. Obviously, it'll be households, companies to some description. That is kind of what we're going to get here to some degree. And indeed, we will be able to judge as well, because in the OBR's forecast, which we get finally,
yes,
one of the reasons...
Well, that was one of the problems.
Exactly.
No, absolutely.
We will get, I think, some sense of whether or not we're back to normal after the mini-budget.
Right. Well, that's interesting about being back to normal, because is there a sense that there could be an overcorrection? I mean, is there a sense, certainly from some Conservative MPs, a worry that actually perhaps the forecasts aren't as dire as people are expecting them to be, and that they could go too far?
Well, I think some of the grim pitch rolling, I think is the technical term in politics, that we've had refers to the post-election tightening that we're going to have. So that's taxes going up and spending going down in kind of accounting terms after the election. It may be that what is revealed today is we get a very different pattern before the election of significant extra taxes paying for significant continuation of badly needed support in the next couple of years. Why? Because cabinet ministers are worried about worsening a recession they feel has already started. Let's
have a look, Simon, at the figure, the figure of inflation. Rishi Sunak has said this is public enemy number one. You can see 11.1%. It's a record high, something like, you know, the highest in 41 years. What's the impact? What's the impact of that on businesses as well as households?
Well, it is a cost of doing business crisis as well as a cost of living crisis. And remember, businesses in a way have a double whammy. The same high prices you see there are pushing their costs up at the same time as emptying the pockets of their customers. And that's why if business groups are saying, listen, they agree. I think I described it as Thelma and Louise last time.
You did.
Dash for Growth when we were here 8 weeks ago. They realised that that was reckless. But they're saying don't give up on growth. If you suck too much money out of the economy immediately, then you'll make this recession worse. And they're looking today for things, give us some reason for hope. Don't give up on growth, because if your ultimate goal is to bring debt down as a percentage of GDP relative to the size of the economy, then you can bring the debt down, but don't forget trying to grow the growth bit, because that can help as well. And so they're going to say, give us a reason, give us some hope that we can invest over this period and give us some confidence.
Vicky, a lot of commentators have said there hasn't been enough of a sense of contrition on behalf of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. They've said mistakes were made when they refer to their predecessors and the mini-budget that we have discussed. Is there a sense of Jeremy Hunt trying to distance himself, detach himself almost from what is just another Conservative government?
Yeah, and I don't think that's going to wash with lots of voters, is it? And that's the problem that he's got, that he's come in, he's talked about mistakes as if they were made by the opposition. But that's not what is happening here. It's mistakes made by the Conservatives, some would say, over several years when it comes to growth. So that makes his task a lot more difficult. Lots of people talking about George Osborne when he brought in austerity and comparing it to that. Now, I think the difference, there's been huge changes since then, if you think about it. George Osborne, I think it was 80% was done through spending cuts. That's not going to be the case here, because I think lots of people feel that the mood of voters has shifted. And whether that's to do with the pandemic or not, people feel like they need to be supported by the state, potentially, more than they did before. And that's what you're hearing from some Conservatives, not all. And there are so many disparate groups within the Conservative Party now, all wanting to protect the thing that they care about, that's going to make his task incredibly difficult.
Well, that's a good point to go to an indoor market in Gloucester, where our reporter Adina Campbell is based, talking to people there about perhaps the sort of support that they would like to see and how they're bearing up with the cost of living crisis and the higher rate of inflation. Adina.
We've actually just come out of the indoor market. We're just a few minutes away at the Seymour Cafe, just outside of the city centre here in Gloucester. A very busy period, lots of breakfasts and hot drinks being served. And we're joined by the co-owner, Luke McCreary. You've put this very tempting plate of hot food in front of us, but it's really hit you hard, hasn't it, producing breakfasts over the recent months with so much going up. Can you tell us, how much more you're paying for things like butter and eggs?
Yeah, the cost is just increasing daily. Literally overnight, a tub of butter is £4. We wake up the next morning, it's £7. It's literally doubling in price. The eggs, there's a shortage now going to be of eggs. The mushrooms are a daily price, which is increasing daily. Yeah, so it really is a bit of a struggle to know what's going to be next or what's going to come out next and go up in price.
So what's the most expensive food item on this plate?
We're looking at sausages, the price of the bacon, so the meat products definitely, and again the eggs with the prices that are going to be saying that there's no eggs left, I'm sure they're going to be hyped right up. Yeah, so it's a bit of a worry.
Have you had to change suppliers at all?
We tried to shop around, yeah. We're keeping the consistency of the type. We used good products, so we try not to drop with the price of it and stuff, but yeah, it's we want to keep the quality, but without losing the customers, and don't want to use the cheapest. So, yeah, I'm not really sure what's going to happen next. Yeah, especially with the price of the gas. The gas and the electric were on a fixed term for another year, but after that, it really is decide what to carry on and do. Whether I don't know how much it's going to rise by. So we can't carry that on to the customer. We can't just keep putting it out for those who won't come back.
So, I mean, this is a really busy cafe. It's been going for 50 years. You've been managing this place for about 4 years.
Yeah.
So many customers coming through the door, and yet how are you managing to sustain those costs and, make sure that you are making a profit?
Well, that's the problem. We are so busy. We're one of the busiest cafes in Gloucester, and yet we're still struggling. My wife daily is working out figures just to see how we can make things cope, trying to cut by seeing without having to lose the quality of everything. So.
And you're saying it's really important for you to keep the customers coming in and to keep the quality of the produce at a good standard.
Yes, without putting the price up by pounds and pounds, because the customers just won't come through the door. I think so.
Thank you, Luke. Well, John, you've been coming here for many years. You love coming to this cafe. Have you been coming less? I mean, how have you been changing your habits in terms of, everything going up, being able to afford a breakfast like this?
No, we haven't been coming less. We've been coming the same as we usually do, because the price is good and the breakfast is good and it's a good quality, and they haven't tried to rip the customers off by banging the prices up too much.
But you've heard there that prices are going up, and Luke and his wife are having to really manage those costs. If that is passed on to the customer, would that mean that you would change how many times you come here? What do you think you'll end up doing, or will you be a loyal customer?
No, I just think we'll still come the same. I agree he's got to put the price up a little bit, because the price costs he's got to pay, and he's got to pass a bit on to the customer. But we'll still come, yeah, because it's still a reasonable price and it's a good breakfast, yeah.
What would you like to see from today's budget?
I'd like to see him give a bit more to the people who are worse off and take a bit more off the people who've got a lot more, or the millionaires who don't pay a lot of tax. A lot of the stores their tax isn't paid a lot because they do it outside, don't they? They send it to that country and do it. And just have a reasonable budget, that most people aren't going to be ripped off by.
Luke, John, thank you both very much indeed. Well, the Seymour Cafe will continue to be busy throughout the whole day. It's open 7 days a week here in Gloucester. So many people like Luke, as a business owner, will be watching very closely once the Chancellor gets on his feet to deliver the budget. So many questions over what the government will be doing in terms of the proposed tax changes and spending cuts. And they'll be watching very closely. So the one thing that we're hearing time and time again is how we can restore some stability. They want to see a clear and detailed plan by the government.
Adina Campbell, thank you very much. I hope you get to have a nice big breakfast while you're there in that cafe in Gloucester. We'll come back to you after the statement to get more reaction. That statement we're expecting in about 15 minutes' time from the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. Let's have a look at some of the expected measures, because, to use that phrase Faisal used earlier, pitch rolling, kite flying, the papers have been full of possible measures that might be announced. But here's ours. A tax threshold freeze, which which would bring far more people into higher rates of tax. Council tax increases. They may lift what they call the referendum cap, which would allow local authorities and councils to increase council tax by more. The £2,500 to £3,000 energy price cap rise. We are going to hear more from Jeremy Hunt about the help that will be given to people following next April. It may be much more targeted and less generous at that point. Top rate tax threshold lowered from £150,000 to £125,000. 25% to 35% increase in windfall tax called on by Labour. It looks as if the government's going to do it. And pension and benefits rising with inflation. That was a huge issue. You now think that's going to happen, Faisal? I
do think that's going to happen. And so a 10% increase in pensions, that's in line with the manifesto commitment on the triple lock. But there wasn't a manifesto commitment about benefits and crucially tax credits too, going up by that amount. They thought about trying to save it by putting it up with earnings rather than with the rate of inflation in September. My understanding is that they will go up with that 10.1% for that too, and that will cost about £5 billion. And why? Because of some of the things you've been hearing about there in Gloucester. Deep concern about what's going to happen when winter hits.
Right, the windfall tax. Opposition made a lot about the windfall tax. The government is doing a windfall tax, but it might go further and for longer.
Yeah, on the oil and gas companies, they already put 25% on top of the 40%, which is higher than other companies pay, so for a total of 65%. We expect that to go to 75%. Labour have been calling for that for some time. But it's a crowd pleaser. People think that's popular. It is not a massive money spinner because the BPs and the Shells of this world, although they're announcing record profits, very little of that actually comes from the UK, and they can offset things like decommissioning oil rigs against it. So that won't be a massive one. But they will now go after other electricity providers, generators. For example, old nuclear, old renewable plants. They have seen the electricity that they sell soar in price, whereas the wind hasn't changed price, the nuclear reactions haven't changed price, their cost of production hasn't moved, so they've been making more money as well. So keep an eye on that. The industry I've been speaking to, they've very little idea how that mechanism will work, but they know the Chancellor's coming knocking on their door for a few billion.
As we've been saying, it's been a very turbulent few months, a turbulent year, really. But let's take a look back over the last few months.
I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, we're at the beginning of a new era. I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today. I'm going to abolish it altogether.
The Bank of England has been forced to take emergency action. Last week's widely criticised mini-budget has been followed by a collapse in the pound.
The Chancellor is abandoning his plans to scrap the 45p rate of income tax.
You'll be Chancellor and Liz Truss will be Prime Minister this time next month.
Absolutely 100%.
He's out. He's been sacked. So Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, he's gone.
Morning, Chancellor.
We will reverse almost all the tax measures announced in the growth plan.
Gone, gone, gone.
45p tax cut, gone. 2-year energy freeze, gone. Economic credibility, gone.
I am a fighter and not a quitter. I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
The government's economic plan, due to be announced on Monday, is delayed.
The Prime Minister and I have decided that it is prudent to make that statement on the 17th of November.
Well, quite simply, we're increasing bank rate because inflation is too high, and it's the bank's job to bring it down.
We are going to see everyone paying more tax. We're going to see spending cuts.
The inflation rate has jumped to 11.1%.
It makes people poorer. That's what inflation does. And it's the enemy that we need to face down.
Well, that just underlines the dizzying pace of change over the last few months. I know you're all exhausted, aren't you, just watching it? But can we just talk about the black hole that is talked about in the public finances, what it means and how they'll address it?
So it's contentious, this description of what is a gap against self-imposed fiscal constraints. This is the idea that the national debt as a proportion of the economy should be falling after a period of time. 5 years is I think, what they'll confirm today as the rule. And if you want to do that, then you get the OBR to calculate what you have to do, plug in the growth numbers, what's the difference set against your current plans, and what would you have to do to correct it. So, from the right and the left, they're being attacked even for using this as a kind of way of seeing the world. That gap, we think, is going to be about 2% of the size of the national income, 50 to 54 billion pounds. But here's the interesting thing about how politically contentious this is. Today, I think we'll get the response from the opposition about whether they back this analysis, whether they back the idea of this gap. And my sense is that they're going to accept it. Not all the policies, not the reasons, not all the cures, but the principle and the baseline. The key word here is the baseline. And this will condition politics now for half a decade.
Well, we're going to talk to two MPs in just a moment. But before we do, Vicki, on this issue of whether it's politically palatable, the tax rises particularly, how is that going to go down?
Well, we've heard a lot, haven't we, about fairness and compassion. That's what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor keep talking about here. And I think that is crucial to whether this is palatable, probably to their own MPs and to voters too. Now, look, the highest earners know what's coming. That's very clear. Big tax rises there. But there's obviously, of course, the people that we talk about in the middle. So those who aren't on universal credit, aren't on benefits, who are not going to get the same support, who don't think they're wealthy at all. And I think that will become the story potentially for Tory MPs as well, as those people, they talk about stealth taxes.
Yes.
I never buy this. The second you get your salary or your pay, you can see what's happened.
Yes.
People are going to look at that. They're going to feel poorer, and there'll be people who do not feel well off feeling a lot poorer. And I think that is going to be a big issue for Tory MPs, as well as the fact that ideologically they don't think taxes should be going up anyway.
Well, let's go and talk to two MPs. As I said, the Tory MP Vicki Ford, Labour MP Rushanara Ali. They're both in central lobby for us. Thank you very much for taking time out to join us today. Vicki Ford, on that issue, precise issue of tax rises, are you comfortable as a Conservative with eye-watering rises in taxation?
So I think we all know that we have a very difficult economic situation that's due to global pressures, and actually when you look at many other similar countries across the world, they face even bigger challenges. But it is really important that this statement helps to get a firm grip on inflation and brings fiscal stability. When I was knocking on doors in Chelmsford at the weekend, that was what they were all asking for, was that fiscal stability.
Yes.
And that is going to mean that we need to find more money to keep our public services going, and I think it's absolutely right that the Chancellor has said we do that in a compassionate way that supports the most vulnerable.
Why is this statement happening today? Why has it been seen as an emergency statement by Jeremy Hunt needed to make eye-wateringly difficult decisions?
That's because of the very, very difficult economic situation that we have.
Caused by a former Conservative Prime Minister and former Chancellor, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng.
Actually, the Bank of England were very clear yesterday when the Governor came here that even before September, they were going to need to start putting in place increases in interest rates in order to try and bring inflation under control. And getting that grip of inflation is what we and other similar countries across the world need to do. Actually, if you look at our growth forecasts, they're higher than every other country in the G7, and our inflation is lower than many of our peers.
Right.
But we do need to bring that fiscal stability, and that is what I think is absolutely right, that Jeremy and Rishi have been taking some time to look again at the numbers and bring this statement to the House today.
Well, Rushanara Ali, when you look broadly at what Jeremy Hunt has been saying, that it'll be those with the broadest shoulders who will be paying the most once he delivers his statement. And he will be extending the number of people paying the higher rate of tax. Well, that's at least what we are expecting. These are policies that you in the Labour Party can support.
Right. Well, look, we've got to remember why we're here. It's because Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and the Conservative Party crashed the economy, and they've damaged our economic credibility internationally. That's also what the Governor of the Bank of England said yesterday in our committee. And we've had a decade of austerity, low growth, low investment, and they are offering more tax rises and more austerity. Now, who is going to support that? What we now need to do, though, is restore economic credibility. Now, one way the government could do that is by having a proper windfall tax that we believe could generate 50 billion. That would take some of the pain away from people who've suffered already because they had their mortgages go up, inflation's up, and all the wider context of what's happened. But let's not forget, this is a crisis that has been caused by the Conservative Party in Downing Street, and this is a government now, Liz Truss's successor, is now trying to fix the failures and the damage caused by the Conservative Party. So what we need to do is make sure that they ensure that it is paid without causing more harm to our economy. We were already in recession, and this plan is unlikely to have anything that we can see in terms of growth, and we do need investment for growth. What we had was unfunded tax cuts in the last budget, and what we need to do is make sure people don't suffer on top of what they've had inflicted on them by this Conservative government.
I mean, people will ask, Vicki Ford, what's the point of the Tory party?
So I have
hang on, what is the point of the Tory party, Vicki Ford, when in 2019, which was supposed to be the election manifesto that Rishi Sunak is sticking by, it said we will not raise the rate of income tax, VAT or national insurance. We know everyone is going to be paying more tax. Jeremy Hunt said so himself. So what is the point of the Conservative Party? There is no longer a party of low taxation.
So I would have to absolutely disagree with what's just been said in Labour. And I will answer the question. I will answer the question. I will answer the question. Where we are right now is due to global pressures, the aftermath of COVID, the war in Ukraine. That is putting pressure on economies all across the world. Unlike the Labour government, which we all remember left us in 2010 with no money, this government has rebuilt the public finances so we could put money in to support 400 billion to support people in COVID. 37 billion has gone to support those on lower incomes and people with cost of living this year. And it is that ability to have stability in finances coupled with good employment numbers. Let's remember, every single Labour government has left employment worse than when they came in.
But there are huge labour shortages, Vicki Ford.
Absolutely. But this government has always focused on supporting especially young people. In 2010, the Labour government had 1 million young people not in employment.
I think to go back to 2010 at this point today, Vicki Ford, is not going to be what voters necessarily and taxpayers want to hear.
But I think it's important to remember that every Labour government has left unemployment worse than when they came in.
All right.
This is a difficult economic time,
but
there are jobs out there caused by global pressures, and actually the UK is better off in our growth numbers than France, Germany, Italy, USA, Canada, Japan. Do you want me to continue?
We're going to show, just before we let you go, this graph, which actually stands in stark contrast to what you've just said, Vicki Ford. Economic growth since COVID-19. I will tell you the figures of G7 countries. United States there at the top, 4.2%. United Kingdom at the very bottom, behind Canada, Italy, France, Japan and Germany at minus 0.4%.
And the IMF is forecasting that this year we will be ahead of all the others. We have to look forward. We have to have fiscal stability in this budget.
Well,
we have
it will
to
depend
get a grip
on what Jeremy
on
Hunt, of
inflation
course, says today.
And have growth.
Right, but just to reiterate, those are the figures, those are the official figures that we have of growth in the United Kingdom since COVID-19, and it stands at minus 0.4%. I'm going to let you two ladies go back into the chamber because in a few minutes' time, Jeremy Hunt Hunt is going to be standing up and unveiling that statement. Just listening to the two of them there, you were talking about the fact that Labour will probably, broadly, in principle, support much of what Jeremy Hunt is going to set out today. It's interesting that the government points to growth figures to say that the UK is doing better. When you look at the figures that we've just seen, it doesn't quite feel like that, does it?
No, and I think also you heard there from, you know, a senior Labour figure there on the Treasury Select Committee, Rashid Ali, attacking austerity. Now, if Labour broadly accepts the tram lines that emerged from today,
they will
not the individual policies, they'll have different priorities and shake it up slightly differently. But if they accept the tram lines, then, you know, that criticism, I'm sure, will be faced by Labour leadership from the left, that have obviously recently empowered the Labour Party. And also the difference now, and the analogy is 1997. In 1997, famously, They
took on Ken Clarke's policies.
And Ken said, oh, I've never would have seen them through. And that was very consequential. We had PFI emerge from that. But I do think you have to, again, I'll stress this point. Are we going to see a difference between what happens in the first 2 or 3 years?
Electoral cycle is very important.
It is, because isn't a lot of this stuff going to be postponed?
So if some of the spending cuts are for after the election, that does mean that Labour has to say broadly whether they would accept them or not. I mean, I presume the government's hoping things might improve and then they don't have to do some of them. But it does mean that Labour do have to answer some of these questions.
The markets will be watching that a bit quite closely, because how much of it are you going to put off? It's typical Treasury sleight of hand to say we'll do all the painful stuff.
I'll go to the gym next week.
4 and 5, exactly. But they might want a down payment now on restoring that credibility. But what Faisal says about Labour Party sort of accepting the basic analysis here is quite important for markets as well, because if that is true, then it means that the markets don't think there's going to be a massive policy change if, for example, there's a Labour Party win the next general election. So that might give them some comfort. But they will be watching to see how much of this you're basically putting on the never in years 4 and 5 and how much you're committing to now. It looks like tax rises come first, real spending cuts come second.
I think it's worth... People might be surprised that the claim from the Chancellor today, given that we've heard eye-watering this, eye-watering that, they might try to claim not that there are no cuts and that there is no... Not only are we not returning to 2010 austerity, because the balance was 80-20.
We're going in. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, in the face of unprecedented global headwinds, families, pensioners, businesses, teachers, nurses and many others are worried about the future. So today we deliver a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild our economy. Our priorities are stability, growth and public services. We also protect the vulnerable, because to be British is to be compassionate, and this is a compassionate Conservative government. We are not alone in facing these problems, but today we respond to an international crisis with British values. We are honest about the challenges and we are fair in our solutions. Yes, we take difficult decisions to tackle inflation and keep mortgage rates down. But our plan also leads to a shallower downturn, lower energy bills, higher growth and a stronger NHS and education system. 3 priorities then today: stability, growth and public services. I start with stability. Mr. Speaker, high inflation is the enemy of stability. It means higher mortgage rates, more expensive food and fuel bills, businesses failing and unemployment rising. It erodes savings, causes industrial unrest and cuts funding for public services. It hurts the poorest the most and eats away at the trust upon which a strong society is built. The Office for Budget Responsibility confirms global factors are the primary cause of current inflation. Most countries are still dealing with the fallout from a once-in-a-century pandemic. The furlough scheme, the vaccine rollout and the response of the NHS did our country proud. But they all have to be paid for. The lasting impact on supply chains has made goods more expensive and fuelled inflation, and this has been worsened by a made-in-Russia energy crisis. Putin's war in Ukraine has caused wholesale gas and electricity prices to rise to 8 times their historic average. Inflation is high here, but higher in Germany, the Netherlands and Italy. Interest rates have risen here, but faster in the US, Canada and New Zealand. Growth forecasts have fallen here, but fallen further in Germany. The International Monetary Fund expects 1/3 of the world's economy to be in recession this year or next. So the Bank of England, which has done an outstanding job since its independence, now has my wholehearted support in its mission to defeat inflation. And I today confirm we will not change its remit. But we need fiscal and monetary policy to work together. And that means the government and the bank working in lockstep. It means, in particular, giving the world confidence in our ability to pay our debts. British families make sacrifices every day to live within their means, and so too must their government, because the United Kingdom will always pay its way. I understand the motivation of my predecessor's mini-budget, and he was correct. He was correct to identify growth as a priority. But unfunded tax cuts are as risky as unfunded spending, which is why we reversed the planned measures. As a result, government borrowing has fallen, the pound has strengthened, and the OBR says today that the lower interest rates generated by the government's actions are already benefiting our economy and public finances. But, Mr. Speaker, credibility cannot be taken for granted. And yesterday's inflation figures show we must continue a relentless fight to bring it down, including a rock-solid commitment to rebuild our public finances. Richard Hughes and his team at the OBR today lay out starkly the impact of global headwinds on the UK economy, and I'm enormously grateful to him and his team for their thorough work. The OBR forecast the UK's inflation rate to be 9.1% this year and 7.4% next year. They confirm that our actions today help inflation to fall sharply from the middle of next year. They also judge that the UK, like other countries, is now in recession. Overall this year, the economy is still forecast to grow by 4.2%. GDP then falls in 2023 by 1.4%, before rising by 1.3%, 2.6% and 2.7% in the following 3 years. The OBR says higher energy prices explain the majority of the downward revision in cumulative growth since March. They also expect a rise in unemployment from 3.6% today to 4.9% in 2024, before falling to 4.1%. Today's decisions mean that over the next 5 years, borrowing is more than halved. This year, we're forecast to borrow 7.1% of GDP, or £177 billion. Next year, 5.5% of GDP, or £140 billion. Then by 2027-28, it falls to 2.4% of GDP, or £69 billion. As a result, underlying debt as a percentage of GDP starts to fall from a peak of 97.6% in 2025-6 to 97.3% in 27-28. I also confirmed 2 new fiscal rules. The first is that underlying debt must fall as a percentage of GDP by the 5th year of a rolling 5-year period. The second, that public sector borrowing over the same period must be below 3% of GDP. And the plan I'm announcing today meets both rules. Today's statement delivers a consolidation of £55 billion and means inflation and interest rates end up significantly lower. We achieve this, Mr. Speaker, in a balanced way. In the short term, as growth slows and unemployment rises, we will use fiscal policy to support the economy. The OBR confirm that because of our plans, the recession is shallower and inflation is reduced. Unemployment is also lower, with about 70,000 jobs saved as a result of our decisions today. Then, once growth returns, we increase the pace of consolidation to get debt falling. This further reduces the pressure on the bank to raise interest rates, because as Conservatives, we do not leave our debts to the next generation. Mr. Speaker, this is a balanced path to stability, tackling inflation to reduce the cost of living and protect pensioner savings whilst supporting the economy on a path to growth. But it means taking difficult decisions. Anyone who says there are easy answers is not being straight with the British people. Some argue for spending cuts, but that would not be compatible with high-quality public services. Others say savings should be found by increasing taxes, but Conservatives know that high-tax economies damage enterprise and erode freedom. We want low taxes and sound money, but Conservatives know sound money has to come first, because inflation eats away at the pound in people's pockets even more insidiously than taxes. So with just under half of the £55 billion consolidation coming from tax and just over half from spending, this is a balanced plan for stability. I turn first to our decisions on tax. I have tried to be fair by following two broad principles. Firstly, we ask those with more to contribute more, and secondly, we avoid the tax rises that damage growth. Although my decisions today do lead to a substantial tax increase, we have not raised headline rates of taxation, and tax as a percentage of GDP will increase by just 1% over the next 5 years. I start with personal taxes. Asking more from those who have more means that the first difficult decision I take on tax is to reduce the threshold at which the 45p rate becomes payable from £150,000 to £125,140. Those earning £150,000 or more will pay just over £1,200 more in tax every year. We're also taking difficult decisions on tax-free allowances. I'm maintaining at current levels the income tax personal allowance, higher rate threshold, main national insurance thresholds, and the inheritance tax thresholds for a further 2 years, taking us to April 2028. Even after that, we'll still have the most generous set of tax-free allowances of any G7 country. I'm also reforming allowances on unearned income. The dividend allowance will be cut from £2,000 to £1,000 next year and then to £500 from April 24. The annual exempt amount for capital gains tax will be cut from £12,300 to £6,000 next year and then £3,000 from April 24. These changes still leave us with more generous allowances than countries like Germany, Ireland, France and Canada. Because the OBR forecast half of all new vehicles will be electric by 2025, to make our motoring tax system fairer, I've decided that from then, electric vehicles will no longer be exempt from vehicle excise duty. Company car tax rates will remain lower for electric vehicles, and I've listened to industry bodies and will limit rate increases to 1 percentage point a year for 3 years from 2025. The OBR expects housing activity to slow over the next 2 years, so the stamp duty cuts announced in the mini-budget will remain in place, but only until the 31st of March 2025. After that, I will sunset the measure, creating an incentive to support the housing market and the jobs associated with it by boosting transaction during the period the economy most needs it. I now turn to business taxes. While I've decided to freeze the employer's NICS threshold until April 2028, we will retain the employment allowance at its new higher level of £5,000. This means 40% of all businesses will pay no NICS at all. The VAT threshold is already more than twice as high as the EU and OECD averages. I will maintain it at that level until March 26. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, successfully negotiated a landmark international tax deal to make sure multinational corporations, including big tech companies, pay the right tax in the countries they operate. I will implement these reforms, making sure the UK gets our fair share. Alongside further measures to tackle tax avoidance and evasion, this will raise an additional £2.8 billion by 27-28. I've also heard concerning reports of abuse and fraud in R&D tax relief for SMEs. So I've decided today to cut the deduction rate for the SME scheme to 86% and the credit rate to 10%, but increase the rate of the separate R&D expenditure credit from 13% to 20%. Despite raising revenue, the OBR have confirmed that these measures have no detrimental impact on the level of R&D investment in the economy. Ahead of the next budget, we'll work with industry to understand what further support R&D intensive SMEs may require. Next, windfall taxes. I have no objection to windfall taxes if they are genuinely about windfall profits caused by unexpected increases in energy prices. But I know the honourable members opposite are getting excited at the talk of windfall taxes. Can I just say that any such tax should be temporary, not deter investment, and recognise the cyclical nature of energy businesses. So, taking account of this, I've decided that from January the 1st until March 28, we will increase the energy profits levy from 25 to 35%. The structure of our energy market also creates windfall profits for low-carbon electricity generation. So from January the 1st, we've decided to introduce a new temporary 45% levy on electricity generators. Together, these measures raise £14 billion next year. Finally, I turn to business rates. It's an important principle that bills should accurately reflect market values. So we'll proceed with the revaluation of business properties from April 23. But I will soften the blow on businesses with a nearly £14 billion tax cut over the next 5 years. Nearly 2/3 of properties will not pay a penny more next year, and thousands of pubs, restaurants and small high street shops will benefit. This will include a new government-funded transitional relief scheme, as called for by the CBI, the British Retail Consortium, the Federation of Small Businesses and others, benefiting around 700,000 businesses. Mr. Speaker, our plan for the cost of living delivers lower inflation, lower mortgage rates, a shallower downturn and lower unemployment. But it also involves public spending discipline. So I turn next to how we protect public services through a challenging period. The Prime Minister's vision for this country has at its heart a strong NHS and world-class education. We know that a strong economy depends on strong public services, so we will protect them as much as we can as we deliver our plan for stability and growth. We do have to take difficult decisions on public finances, so we're going to grow public spending, but we're going to grow it more slowly than the growth in the economy. For the remaining 2 years of the spending review, we'll protect the increases in departmental budgets we've already set out in cash terms, and then grow resource spending at 1% a year in real terms in the 3 years that follow. Although departments will have to make efficiencies to deal with inflationary pressures in the next 2 years, this decision means overall spending in public services will continue to rise in real terms for the next 5 years. Before I turn to our plan for schools and the NHS, I start with 2 other areas of spending. The Department for Work and Pensions has a critical role in supporting people into work, and I am proud to live in a country with one of the most comprehensive safety nets anywhere in the world. But I am also concerned that we've seen a sharp increase in economically inactive working-age adults of around 630,000 people since the start of the pandemic. Employment levels have yet to return to pre-pandemic levels, which is bad for businesses who cannot fill vacancies and bad for people missing out on the opportunity to do well for themselves and their families. So the Prime Minister has asked the Work and Pensions Secretary to do a thorough review of issues holding back workforce participation to conclude early in the new year. Alongside this, I am also committed to helping people already in work to raise their incomes, progress in work and become financially independent. So we will ask over 600,000 more people on universal credit to meet with a work coach so that they can get the support they need to increase their hours or earnings. I've also decided to move back the managed transition of people from employment and support allowance onto universal credit to 2028 and will invest an extra £280 million in DWP to crack down on benefit fraud and error over the next 2 years. And the government's review of the state pension age will also be published in early 2023. Our security at home depends on our security overseas. So I turn next to defence and other international commitments. The privilege of being this country's Foreign Secretary showed me firsthand the enormous respect in which this country is held, because the United Kingdom is and has always been a force for good in the world. Nothing sums that up more than the courage of our armed forces, men and women who risk their lives every day in defence of our territory and our belief in freedom. Alongside them, I salute the citizens of another country right on the front line of that fight today, the brave people of Ukraine. Yeah. The United Kingdom has given their military support worth £2.3 billion since the start of Putin's invasion, the second highest contribution in the world after the United States, which demonstrates that our commitment to democracy and open societies remains steadfast. In that context, the Prime Minister and I both recognise the need to increase defence spending. But before we make that commitment, it's necessary to revise and update the integrated review written as it was before the Ukraine invasion. And I've asked for that vital work to be completed ahead of the next budget, and to today confirm we will continue to maintain the defence budget at least 2% of GDP to be consistent with our NATO commitment. Another important international commitment is to overseas aid. The OBR's forecasts show a significant shock to public finances, so it won't be possible to return to the 0.7% target until the fiscal situation allows. We remain fully committed to that target, and the plans that I've set out today assume that ODA spending will remain around 0.5% for the forecast period. As a percentage of GNI, we were the third highest donor in the G7 last year, and I am proud our aid commitment has saved thousands of lives around the world. So I look forward to working closely with my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, now rightly back in his place in Cabinet, to make sure we continue to play a leadership role in tackling global poverty. The United Kingdom has also been a global leader on climate change, cutting emissions by more than any other G20 country. But with the existential vulnerability we face, now would be the wrong time to step back from our international climate responsibilities. So I also confirm that despite the economic pressures, we remain fully committed to the historic Glasgow Climate Pact agreed at COP26, including a 68% reduction in our own emissions by 2030. I turn to education. Mr. Speaker, being pro-education is being pro-growth. Yeah. But providing our children with a good education is not just an economic mission, it's a moral mission, one to which my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has always been deeply committed. Thanks to the efforts of successive Conservative education secretaries, particularly my right honourable friends from Surrey Heath and from Bognor Regis, We have risen 9 places in the global league tables for maths and reading in the last 7 years. I still, however, have concerns that not all school leavers get the skills they need for a modern economy. But for the first time ever, this country has a Conservative Education Secretary who left school at 16 to become an apprentice and knows firsthand why good skills matter. There are many important initiatives in place, but as Chancellor, I want to know the answer to one simple question. Will every young person leave the education system with the skills they would get in Japan, Germany or Switzerland? So I've appointed Sir Michael Barber to advise me and my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, on the implementation of our skills reform programme. As we raise the skill levels of our school leavers, I want also to ensure that even in an economic crisis, the improvement in school standards continues to accelerate. Some have suggested putting VAT on independent school fees as a way of increasing core funding for schools, which would raise about £1.7 billion. But according to certain estimates, that would result in up to 90,000 children from the independent sector switching to state schools, giving with one hand only to take away with another. So instead of being ideological, I'm going to be practical. Because we want school standards to continue to rise for every single child, we're going to do more than protect the school's budget. We're going to increase it. And I can announce today that next year and the year after, we will invest an extra £2.3 billion per annum in our schools. Our message to heads and teachers and classroom assistants is thank you for your brilliant work. We need it to continue, and in difficult economic circumstances, a Conservative government is investing more in the public service that defines all our futures. Mr. Speaker, the service we depend on more than any other is the NHS. As a former Health Secretary, I know how hard people are working on the front line and how much they're struggling after the pandemic. The biggest issues are workforce shortages and pressures in the social care sector. So today I address them both. On staff shortages, the former chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee put forward a case for a long-term workforce plan. He even wrote a book about it, which I've read. I've listened carefully to his proposals, and I believe they have merit. So the Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS will publish an independently verified plan for the number of doctors, nurses and other professionals we'll need in 5, 10 and 15 years' time, taking full account of the need for better retention and productivity improvements. I've also listened to extensive representations about the challenges facing the social care sector. It did a heroic job looking after children, disabled adults and older people during the pandemic. Its 1.6 million employees work incredibly hard, but even outside the pandemic, the increasing number of over 80s is putting massive pressure on their services. I also heard very real concerns from local authorities, particularly about their ability to deliver the Dilnot reforms immediately. So I will delay the implementation of this important reform for 2 years, allocating the funding to allow local authorities to provide more care packages. I also want the social care system to help free up some of the 13,500 hospital beds that are occupied by those who should be at home. So I've decided to allocate for adult social care additional grant funding of £1 billion next year and £1.7 billion the year after. Combined with savings from the delayed Dilnot reforms and more council tax flexibilities, this means an increase in funding available for the social care sector of up to £2.8 billion next year and £4.7 billion the year after. That's a big increase, But how we look after our most vulnerable citizens is not just a practical issue. It speaks to our values as a society. So today's decision will allow the social care system to deliver an estimated 200,000 more care packages over the next 2 years, the biggest increase in funding under any government of any colour in history. The NHS budget has been increased to record levels to deal with the pandemic. And today I'm asking the NHS to join all public services in tackling waste and inefficiency. We want Scandinavian quality alongside Singaporean efficiency, both better outcomes for citizens and better value for taxpayers. That does not mean asking people on the front line, often exhausted and burned out, to work harder, which would not be possible or fair. But it does mean asking challenging questions about how to reform all our public services for the better. So with respect to the NHS, I've asked former Health Secretary and Chair of the Norfolk and Waveney Integrated Care System, Patricia Hewitt, to help me and the Health Secretary achieve that by advising us on how to make sure the new integrated care boards, the local NHS bodies, operate efficiently and with appropriate autonomy and accountability. I've also had discussions with NHS England about the inflationary pressures on their budget. I recognise that efficiency savings alone will not be enough to deliver the services we all need. So because of difficult decisions taken elsewhere today, I will increase the NHS budget in each of the next 2 years by £3.3 billion. The Chief Executive of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, has said that this should provide sufficient funding for the NHS to fulfil its key priorities. She said it shows the government is serious about its commitment to prioritise our NHS. £3.3 billion for the NHS, £4.7 billion for social care, a record £8 billion package for our health and care system. That is a Conservative government putting the NHS first. Mr. Speaker, the NHS and schools in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland face equivalent pressures. So the Barnett consequentials of today's decisions mean an extra £1.5 billion for the Scottish Government, £1.2 billion for the Welsh Government, £650 million for the Northern Ireland Executive. That is more resources for the schools and hospitals in our devolved nations next year, the year after, and every year thereafter. Mr. Speaker, our support for public services means that despite needing to find £55 billion in savings and tax rises, we are protecting the amount going into public services in real terms over the 5-year period. But if we're going to sustain our public services and avoid a doom loop of ever higher taxes and ever lower dynamism, we need economic growth. So I now turn, well, they've never been interested in growth, but we on this side of the House
I want to get to the end of the budget statement like the rest of the people of this country. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So let's start with a difficult message for the party opposite. You cannot borrow your way to growth. Sound money is the rock. Sound money is the rock upon which long-term prosperity rests. But it isn't enough on its own. Our plan is designed to build a high-wage, high-skill economy that leads to long-term prosperity. In his May's lecture, my right honourable friend the Prime Minister identified the keys to doing this: people, capital and ideas. Today's increase in the education budget demonstrates our commitment to people and skills. And I now outline 3 further growth priorities: energy, infrastructure and innovation. Cheap, low-carbon, reliable energy must sit at the heart of any modern economy. But Putin's weaponization of international gas prices has helped drive the cost of our national energy consumption right up. This year we'll be spending an extra £150 billion on energy compared to pre-pandemic levels, equivalent to paying for an entire second NHS through our energy bills. In 2019, a third of global emissions came from energy supply. So unless we act radically to change our approach, we'll both bankrupt our economy and harm our planet. Over the long term, there's only one way to stop ourselves being at the mercy of international gas prices: energy independence combined with energy efficiency. Energy independence, so neither Putin nor anyone else can use energy to blackmail us, and energy efficiency to reduce demand and climate impact as much as possible. Now, Britain is a global leader in renewable energy. Last year, nearly 40% of our electricity came from offshore wind, solar, and other renewables. Since 2010, our renewable energy production has grown faster than any other large country in Europe. But we need to go even further with a major acceleration of homegrown technologies like offshore wind, carbon capture and storage, and above all, nuclear. This will deliver new jobs, industries and export opportunities and secure the clean, affordable energy we need to power our future economy and reach net zero. So today I can announce the government will proceed with a new nuclear power plant at Sizewell C. Subject to final government approvals, the contracts for the initial investment will be signed with relevant parties, including EDF, in the coming weeks. This will create 10,000 highly skilled jobs and provide reliable, low-carbon power to the equivalent of 6 million homes for 50 years. Our £700 million investment is the first state backing for a nuclear project in over 30 years and represents the biggest step in our journey to energy independence. But, Mr. Speaker, energy efficiency is just as important. So today, we set our country a new national ambition. By 2030, we want to reduce energy consumption from buildings and industry by 15%. Reducing demand by this much means, in today's prices, a £28 billion saving from our national energy bill, or £450 off the average household bill. This must be a shared mission, with families and businesses playing their part. But so will the government play our part. In this Parliament, we're already planning to invest in energy efficiency a total of £6.6 billion. Today I'm announcing new funding from 2025 of a further £6 billion, doubling our annual investment to deliver this new national ambition. Our commitment to the British people is over time to remove the single biggest driver of inflation and volatility facing British businesses and consumers. So my right honourable friend, the Business and Energy Secretary, will publish further details on our energy independence plans and launch a new energy efficiency task force shortly. Mr. Speaker, if a modern economy needs secure, clean and affordable energy, it also needs good roads, rail, broadband and 5G infrastructure. Such connections matter because they allow wealth and opportunity to spread to every corner of the country. And that is why infrastructure is our second growth priority. Thanks to decisions by this Conservative government, right now workers right across the country are building or maintaining thousands of miles of roads and railways, installing mobile masts and broadband cables to connect the remotest parts of rural Britain, building and repairing hospitals and constructing new wind turbines in the North Sea. When looking for cuts, capital is sometimes seen as an easy option, but doing so limits not our budgets, but our future. So today I can announce that I'm not cutting a penny from our capital budgets in the next 2 years and maintaining them at that level in cash terms for the following 3 years. That means that although we're not growing our capital budget as planned, it will still increase from £63 billion 4 years ago to £114 billion next year, £115 billion the year after, and remain at that level, more than double what it was under the last Labour government. Smart countries build on their long-term commitments rather than discard them. So today I confirm that because of this decision, alongside Sizewell C, we will deliver the core Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2 to Manchester, and East West Rail, and the new hospitals programme, and gigabit broadband rollout. All these and more will be funded as promised, with over £600 billion of investment over the next 5 years to connect our country and grow our economy. Our National Conservative mission is to level up economic opportunity across the country. And that too needs investment in infrastructure. So I will also proceed with round 2 of the Levelling Up Fund, at least matching the £1.7 billion value of round 1. We'll also drive growth across the UK by working with the Scottish Government on the feasibility study for the A75, supporting the Advanced Technology Research Centre in Wales, and funding a trade and investment event in Northern Ireland next year. But to unlock growth right across the country, we need to make it easier for local leaders to make things happen without banging on a Whitehall door. Our brilliant mayors, like Andy Street and Ben Houchin, have shown the power of civic entrepreneurship. We need more of this inspirational local leadership. So today I can announce a new devolution deal that will bring an elected mayor to Suffolk, and deals to bring mayors to Cornwall, Norfolk, and an area in the North East to follow shortly. We're also making progress towards trailblazer devolution deals with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and West Midlands Combined Authority, and soon over half of England will be covered by devolution deals. Taken together, that £600 billion investment in our future growth represents the largest investment in public works for 40 years. So our children and grandchildren can be confident that this Conservative government is investing in their future. Energy and infrastructure. And now our third growth priority, innovation. Mr. Speaker, we have a national genius for innovation. Britain is the land of Newton, Darwin, Fleming, Faraday, Franklin, Gilbert and Berners-Lee, the home of 3 of the world's top 10 universities, the country with the largest life science and technology sectors in Europe. Thanks to successive Conservative governments, we remain a science superpower. And I salute the work of the former Chancellor George Osborne, my right honourable friend from Tunbridge Wells, and my honourable friend the Science Minister and member for Mid Norfolk, for laying the vital foundations to make this possible. 21st century economies will be defined by new developments in artificial intelligence, quantum technologies and robotics. But we need to be better at turning world-class innovation into world-class companies. So as a former entrepreneur, I had to get that in somewhere, I want to combine our technology and science brilliance with our formidable financial services to turn Britain into the world's next Silicon Valley. We learned from the success of Nigel Lawson's Big Bang in 1986 that smart regulatory reform can spur investment from all over the world. So today, using our Brexit freedoms, I confirm the next steps in our supply-side transformation. By the end of next year, we will decide and announce changes to EU regulations in our 5 growth industries: digital, life sciences, green industries, financial services and advanced manufacturing. And I've asked the Chief Scientific Officer, Sir Patrick Vallance, who did such a brilliant job in the pandemic, to lead our work on how to do this. The second lesson of Nigel Lawson's Big Bang is the most important driver of global success is not tax subsidies, but competition. So we will legislate to give the Digital Markets Unit new powers to challenge monopolies and increase the competitive pressure to innovate. To further spur competition, I've listened to requests from businesses, and today I'm removing import tariffs on over 100 goods used by UK businesses in their production processes, from car seat parts to bicycle frames. I'll also change our approach to investment zones, which will now focus on leveraging our research strengths by being centred on universities in left-behind areas to help build clusters for our new growth industries. My Right Honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, will work with mayors, devolved administrations and local partners to achieve this, with the first decisions announced ahead of the spring budget. I've heard some speculation that we might cut the research and development budget today, but I believe that would be a profound mistake. In our 2017 manifesto, we announced a target to invest 2.4% of our GDP in R&D, and the latest ONS data suggests the UK is close to meeting that target. I want to go further, so today I protect our entire research budget and confirm that we'll increase public funding for R&E to 20 billion by 24-25 as part of our mission to make the United Kingdom a science superpower. And finally, Nigel Lawson's Big Bang inspires us today, but nearly 40 years on, we must stay true to its mission to make the UK the world's most innovative and competitive global financial centre. So to further support investment across our economy, I also announced that we're publishing our decision on Solvency II, which will unlock tens of billions of pounds of investment for our growth-enhancing industries. 3 priorities for growth: energy security, investment in infrastructure, and a plan to turn the United Kingdom into the world's next Silicon Valley, transforming British intellectual genius into British commercial success. But alongside British genius, we must remember another great national quality: British compassion. So this final part of our plan protects the most vulnerable, and it's to that I now turn. Mr. Speaker, strong public finances aren't just to make accountants happy. It's because we took difficult decisions in 2010 that we could afford record funding increases for the NHS, the landmark furlough scheme, and now the energy price guarantee. Today, the discipline that we've shown means we can provide targeted support to help our most vulnerable citizens with the cost of living. One of the biggest worries for families is energy bills, and I pay tribute to my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Spelthorne, and the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, for their leadership in this area. This winter, we will stick with their plan to spend £55 billion to help households and businesses with their energy bills, one of the largest support plans in Europe. From April, we'll continue the energy price guarantee for a further 12 months at a higher level of £3,000 per year for the average household. With prices forecast to remain elevated throughout next year, this will mean an average of £500 support for every household in the country. At the same time, for the most vulnerable, we'll introduce additional cost of living payments next year of £900 to households on means-tested benefits, £300 to pensioner households, and £150 for individuals on disability benefit. We'll also provide an additional £1 billion of funding to enable a further 12-month extension to the Household Support Fund, helping local authorities to assist those who might otherwise fall through the cracks. And for those households who use alternative fuels, such as heating oil and LPG to heat their homes, I'm today doubling the amount of support from £100 to £200, which will be delivered as soon as possible this winter. And before the end of the year, we'll also bring forward a new targeted approach to support businesses from next April. But I want to go further to support people most exposed to high inflation. Around 4 million families live in the social rented sector, almost 1/5 of households in England. Their rents are set at 1% above the September inflation rate, which means that on current plans, they're set to see rent hikes next year of up to 11%. For many, that would just be unaffordable. So today I can announce that this government will cap the increase in social rents to a maximum of 7% in 23-24. Compared to current plans, that is a saving for the average tenant of £200 next year. This government introduced, I thought they cared about the most vulnerable. This government introduced the national living wage, which has been a giant step in eliminating low pay. So today, I'm accepting the recommendation of the Low Pay Commission to increase it next year by 9.7%. That means from April 23, the hourly rate will be £10.42, which represents an annual pay rise worth over £1,600 to a full-time worker. It's expected to benefit over 2 million of the lowest paid workers in our country and keeps us on track for our target to reach 2/3 of median earnings by 2024. And it is the largest increase in the UK's national living wage ever. Mr. Speaker, there have also been some representations to keep the uplift to working age and disability benefits below the level of inflation, given the financial constraints we face. But that would not be consistent with our commitment to protect the most vulnerable. So today I also commit to uprate such benefits by inflation with an increase of 10.1%. That is an expensive commitment costing £11 billion, but it means 10 million working age families will see a much needed increase next year, which speaks to our priorities as a government and our priorities as a nation. On average, a family on universal credit will benefit next year by around £600, and to increase the number of households who can benefit from this decision, I'll also exceptionally increase the benefit cap with inflation next year. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I've talked a lot about British values of compassion, hard work, dignity, fairness. There is no more British value than our commitment to protect and honour those who built the country we live in. So to support the poorest pensioners, I have decided to increase the pension credit by 10.1%, which is worth up to £1,470 for a couple and £960 for a single pensioner in our most vulnerable households. But the cost of living crisis is harming not just our poorest pensioners, but all pensioners. So because we've taken difficult decisions elsewhere today, I can also announce that we will fulfil our pledge to the country to protect the pensions triple lock. In April, the state pension will increase in line with inflation, an £870 increase, which represents the biggest ever increase in the state pension. And to the millions of pensioners who will benefit from this measure, I say now and always, this government is on your side. Mr. Speaker, there is a global energy crisis, a global inflation crisis, and a global economic crisis. But the British people are tough, inventive, and resourceful. We have risen to bigger challenges before. We aren't immune to these headwinds, but with this plan for stability, growth, and public services, we will face into the storm. There may be a recession made in Russia, but there is a recovery made in Britain. And we commit to our plan today with British resilience and British compassion. Because of the difficult decisions we take today, we strengthen our public finances, bring down inflation, protect jobs, We build the first state-backed nuclear power station for 30 years. We continue the biggest programme of capital investment for 40 years. We protect standards in schools, cut NHS waiting times, fund social care, cap energy bills, support those on benefits. We protect workers with the biggest ever increase in the national living wage, and our pensioners on the triple lock with the biggest ever increase in the state pension. This is a balanced plan for stability, a plan for growth, and a plan for public services. It shows that you don't need to choose either a strong economy or good public services. With Conservatives, and only with Conservatives, you get both. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Hunt sitting down there being congratulated by the Prime Minister and his colleague in the Treasury. It's now time to hear Rachel Reeves for Labour, the Shadow Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Chancellor for that statement. So here we are, the end of 2022. 3 Prime Ministers, 4 Chancellors and 4 budgets later. And where do we find ourselves? In a worse place than we started the year. Inflation spiralling, growth plunging, living standards falling. Mr. Speaker, Britain is a great country with fantastic strengths. But because of this government's mistakes, we are being held back. What people will be asking themselves at the next election is this: are me and my family better off with a Conservative government? And the answer is no. The mess we are in is the result of 12 weeks of Conservative chaos, but also 12 years of Conservative economic failure. Growth dismal, investment down, wages squeezed, public services crumbling. And what does the Chancellor have to offer today? More of the same, with working people paying the price for his failure. The Chancellor should have come here today to ask for forgiveness. At the very least, he could have offered an apology. But no, instead he says that his predecessor was correct in his analysis at the mini-budget, the mini-budget that put our economy into freefall. All the country got today was an invoice for the economic carnage that this government has created. Never again can the Conservatives be seen as the party of economic competence. Now, it's been clear for weeks what they wanted to do. Step 1, blame global factors. Step 2, pretend the mini-budget is nothing to do with any of them. Step 3, portray the Chancellor and Prime Minister as the people who can clear up the mess of their party's own making. And step 4, attempt to lay some so-called traps for the Labour Party. They've even had George Osborne in to advise them on how to party like it's 2010. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't a game. This is about people's lives. This is about people's livelihoods. It's about their ability to pay the mortgage, their ability to pay the rent, and the ability to pay the bills after 12 years of Conservative stagnation that has left our country so much worse off. It's about the fact that when the global storm hits, we are uniquely exposed because of the choices that the Conservatives have made. Now, Mr. Speaker, nobody doubts that the COVID pandemic and war in Ukraine have had profound implications. And the whole House is united in its condemnation of Russia's aggression. But Britain's problems started before the COVID pandemic, and they started before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. The UK has grown by an average of 1.4% a year under the Conservatives, compared to 2.1% a year in the Labour years before that. We are the only G7 economy that is still poorer than before the pandemic. As the Governor of the Bank of England told the Treasury Select Committee yesterday, the US has grown by 4.2% since the pandemic. The GDP of Eurozone countries is 2.1% higher. And yet the UK is 0.7% smaller than at the start of the pandemic. We aren't recovering. We are heading into recession, as the OBR has confirmed today. Now, the Governor described these differences as dramatic and as stark. How does the Chancellor describe them? And how does he explain them? This is the price of a decade of Tory choices and economic failure. And it is set to continue, with the IMF forecasting that out of the 38 most industrialised economies, the UK will have the slowest growth of any of them in the next 2 years. Now, the Chancellor is saying today that he will be honest. So let's be honest. No one was talking about cuts to public spending 2 months ago, and no other advanced economy is cutting spending or increasing taxes on working people as they head into recession. This government has forced our economy into a doom loop, where low growth leads to higher taxes, lower investment and squeezed wages, with a running down of public services, all of which hits economic growth again. And instead of learning from the mistakes of the last decade, they're simply repeating them. We need to break free from this vicious cycle of stagnation with fairer choices and a proper plan for economic growth. Now, the Chancellor and Prime Minister are trying to convince us that Britain faces problems that are nothing to do with them, that the mini-budget, which imposed a Tory mortgage premium, put pensions in peril and trashed our reputation around the world, was all just a bad dream. It's their Bobby Ewing strategy. Downing Street as Dallas. Old cast members return as if nothing had happened, with tangled plot lines to keep the audience. But the truth is, it has lost all credibility. And everyone knows it is long past time that this series was cancelled. And the problem for the British people is this. This is not a dream. This is the everyday nightmare of Tory Britain. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives would have us believe that they are not responsible for the last 12 years of failure. In doing so, they take the British people for fools. Millions are already worried sick about how to make ends meet and are now facing the added stress of higher mortgage payments. The prospect of home ownership becoming more and more remote, and rents going through the roof. What does this mean? Family holidays cancelled, savings depleted, hopes for the future replaced by sleepless nights. And all of this on top of the fact that the average worker is earning less today than when the Tories came to power 12 years ago. The government has presided over the biggest wage squeeze in centuries. This was a crisis made in Downing Street, and it is ordinary working people who are paying the price. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I was coming into Westminster today, I read a timely warning from the police about pickpockets in the area. They warn, you may have an idea of what a pickpocket looks like, but they're far less likely to stand out in a crowd than you think. They may work in teams to try and distract the target. And one of their tactics is where a thief will appear to be over-friendly while pickpocketing you. Now, I must report that in the last hour, the Conservatives have picked the pockets of purses and wallets of the entire country as the Chancellor has deployed a raft of stealth taxes, taking billions of pounds from ordinary working people. A Conservative double whammy that sees frozen tax thresholds and double-digit inflation erode the real value of people's wages. Just one of those freezes in the personal allowance will cost an average earner more than £600, make it even harder to make ends meet. At the same time, the government is forcing local councils to put up council tax. Now, the Chancellor seems to have confirmed today a council tax bombshell worth £100 for a typical Band D property, taking their council tax above £2,000 for the first time. Local people, including those with Conservative councils, will be forced to pay more because of the destruction that the Conservatives have wreaked on our economy. And this at a time when councils are already in dire straits because of cuts by Conservative governments. Now, they probably sat around the tables in Downing Street thinking that this was some clever trick. But no one is to blame except the government that's been in power for 12 years, not local authorities, but this Tory government. More taxes, more inflation, higher mortgages. And instead of tricks and stealth taxes, why don't they have a proper economic plan for Britain that puts working people at their heart? And why do they refuse to have a real industrial strategy that gives business certainty, unlocks investment, and means that Britain can once again lead the world in the industries of the future? Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor is trying to claim that this statement today is fair. Yet we learn that of all the things that he could save from the wreckage of the kamikaze budget that he chooses to press ahead with is their plan to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. At a time when he's urging wage restraint for everybody else, how can he remotely claim that this is fair? And after weeks of will he, won't he, we learn today that the Chancellor won't, after all, be clapping down on non-doms. Tax-free income for millionaires while millions face frozen tax allowances and council tax highs. How can he possibly claim that this is fair? He refuses to act, and I wonder why. Maybe that was the only policy that he can't get signed off by number 10 Downing Street. I say, if you make your Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here. And what about the private equity managers earning millions who benefit from a tax break on their bonuses, which mean that they pay far less tax as a proportion of their incomes than ordinary hard-working people? Did the Chancellor close that loophole today and make sure that they pay their fair share of tax? He did not. He made ordinary working people pay the price instead. Because, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, we've seen how quick the Conservatives are to raise taxes on working people. Now, the Chancellor has even compared himself to Scrooge. He's asking working people to take the hit, with less money in their pockets in the run-up to Christmas, but also for years to come. But if you're a banker, a non-dom, or a private equity manager, don't worry. Scrooge hasn't cancelled your Christmas. And that's before we even get onto the energy giants. After months of resistance, well, the Honourable Lady says from a sedentary what about taxes? Well, the non-doms don't pay taxes. That is the whole point, and that is why the Chancellor should have closed that loophole today. And this is before we even get on to the energy giants. Really? They don't pay taxes. And that's before we even get on to the energy giants. After months of resistance from this Prime Minister, the government has finally been dragged kicking and screaming to extend the windfall tax that Labour have been calling for since January. Yet they still leave billions of pounds on the table. Profits that are the windfalls of war. Because they have failed to close a huge loophole that they created that hands out massive tax breaks to those oil and gas giants for doing the things that they were going to do anyway. For those wondering why, some energy giants have paid no windfall tax in the last quarter, despite record profits and eye-watering bills for consumers. The answer is the decisions that this Prime Minister made when he was Chancellor, confirmed by the current Chancellor, lets the energy giants off the hook once again. Mr. Speaker, the government has announced plans for energy bills next year, but bill payers will still see prices go up next spring, leaving far too many people wondering how they'll make ends meet. For every pound of windfall tax left on the table, people are faced with higher prices on their bills. And the Tories' failure on energy goes back much further. They closed down gas storage, blocked onshore wind and solar, and slashed support for home insulation. Now, today the Chancellor says that he will act on energy efficiency, but I'm afraid it's all far too late. We called for the insulation of 2 million homes a year more than 12 months ago that could cut bills by £1,000, not just for 1 year, but for every year to come. And they did nothing. Insulation levels in 2021 were 20 times lower than in 2010 because of their neglect. And now he proposes a package, but we have to wait until 2025 for them to act. Why? When people are facing a bills crisis now, years and years will have gone by while he sits back, millions of families could have been helped, and they have not been. And still they block renewable power, like onshore wind, that could bring energy bills down, create good jobs in all parts of the country, and ensure that Britain can lead the way in the industries of the future. Clean power is the right solution to the energy price crisis, but yet again the Conservatives have failed. They have failed to protect us from future shocks, failed to tackle the cost of living crisis, and failed to take the decisions in our country's national interest. It is because they have failed to grow the economy that they are having to bring forward yet another statement with tax rises and spending cuts. The last Prime Minister and Chancellor embarked on a reckless sugar rush that abandoned fiscal rectitude, and they all cheered for it. But the current Prime Minister and Chancellor have given up on growth altogether. And how do we know? Because the Office of Budget Responsibility has seen their plans, and they've downgraded growth in the months and years ahead. Achieving the levels of growth this country needs isn't like flicking on a switch. No. We need a serious long-term plan to get our economy growing again, powered by the talents and efforts of millions of ordinary working people and thousands of businesses. We need a fairer, greener, more dynamic economy, creating good jobs in every part of the country, in homegrown renewables, in green hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, with Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, with a modern industrial strategy where government works hand in hand with business, properly fixing business rates so that small businesses and our high street businesses thrive again, and fixing the holes in the government's Brexit deal to help UK businesses trade and compete in the world, and ensuring that Britain is the best place to start and grow a business. That is what a Labour government will do. Mr. Speaker, while our public services are struggling and working people are being stretched, the rampant waste and cronyism from this government continues apace. It does not seem to concern the Chancellor that his government dished out £3.5 billion of contracts to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. And the latest Prime Minister spent so much time when he was Chancellor practising his signature for his glossy Instagram graphics that he failed to put in place even the most simple checks on COVID support. That is why the former Treasury Minister, Lord Agnew, described the current Prime Minister's fraud failures as schoolboy errors. The Prime Minister left the doors to the vaults wide open to organised criminals and drugs gangs. They helped themselves to £6.7 billion of taxpayers' money, money that the government is failing to retrieve. And last month it was slipped out that the Taxpayer Protection Task Force, set up to get this money back, is being wound down. The government's just given up, and the Conservatives are turning yet again to our crucial public services to make up the money. Mr. Speaker, the fraudsters may think that they have got away with it, but a Labour government will hunt them down for everything that they have taken from the taxpayer. The country is sick of being ripped off by the Tories. We want our money back. Because of Tory failure, our crumbling public services are set to suffer even more. Ordinary people lose yet again. Never before have people paid so much in tax and yet got so little in return. At the weekend, the Chancellor admitted that the NHS was already on the brink of collapse. With 7 million people on NHS waiting lists, how much longer will that list get? 3 in 10 people are leaving education without GCSE English and maths. What will this do to our society and our future economy? And why do the Tories have an ideological objection to putting VAT on school fees, which the Chancellor himself admits will raise £1.7 billion? By their actions, it is clear the government does not value our public services or the contribution of those working in them. And what do we hear today? Reviews on schools and the NHS workforce, on social care and on waste. But what we need is action. The time for delivery is now, not time for more reviews. And now we hear from the Chancellor, who had previously said that one of his biggest regrets as Health Secretary was failing to fix social care. And today he has further delayed the government's much-promised social care cap. This is yet another broken promise after 12 years of Tory failure on social care. The Tories have trashed our public services, and the statement today is proof that they are doing nothing to turn that around. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have crashed our economy, given up on growth, and sent inflation through the roof. And as usual, it is ordinary working people who are paying the price. It is a familiar tune. Every mortgage they raise, every cut they make, every tax they hike, the Conservatives are costing you. And what have we heard today? Yet more excuses and unfair choices. They have failed to tackle the cost of living crisis. They have failed to show how they will fix our public services. They have failed to show how they will deliver growth. And they have no plan for the future of our country. And everything we have heard today, and after 12 long years of Tory failure, the conclusion that we must come to is that Britain can no longer afford a Conservative government.
Right. Let me start with the chair of the Select Committee.
And that brings us to the end of both Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor's statement, the autumn statement, and the response by the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Well, there is an awful lot to unpack there. Perhaps one of the most startling sentences came early on in Jeremy Hunt's statement. Britain is in recession. He said the economy will shrink by 1.4% next year, then growth of 1.3% in 2024, 2.6% in 2025. As we know, the headline figure of inflation is at 11.1%. Jeremy Hunt said that the Office for Budget Responsibility agreed that global factors were the primary cause of that high level of inflation, whereas Labour, Rachel Reeves, was very keen to root it into what she called the kamikaze budget of Liz Truss, the former Conservative Prime Minister, and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. They did confirm that pensions will rise by inflation by over 10%, and the same with benefits. That uprating will cost, Jeremy Hunt said, £11 billion a year. Freezing of tax allowances and thresholds, many of them until 2028. But there was a somewhat surprising announcement of an increase in education spending. Jeremy Hunt said a commitment to schools of £2.3 billion a year and £3.3 billion a year for the NHS. Let me just take you through those main measures. Tax thresholds frozen. The top rate tax threshold reduced from £150,000 to £125,140. As I said, those increases in education spending, and then £2.8 billion for social care. Overseas aid to remain at 0.5% of GDP, not going back up to 0.7% until the economy, Jeremy Hunt says, it can. Stamp duty holiday ends March 2025. That was another measure of Liz Truss. It's going then. Sizewell C nuclear plant to go ahead. Extra spending for devolved governments and departmental spending to rise by 1% after 2025. Many decisions being delayed until 2025 because, of course, we may well have had an election. Energy price cap increases to £3,000 from April. This is the energy price guarantee. The average bill, around £2,500, will rise to £3,000. We'll talk about the extra and continued help in a moment. As I said, the pension's triple lock protected. Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2 to go ahead. National living wage to rise to £10.42 from April. And as I said, benefits to rise in line with inflation, and social rents capped at 7% in 2023 to 24. As I said, there is an awful lot to digest. We have our experts here with us, and in a moment we are going to talk to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, who has just rushed over from Parliament to join us. But Vicki, first of all, your impressions of the budget. First of all, how politically palatable it will be and whether it is balanced in the way Jeremy Hunt said.
Look, I think Conservative MPs, having heard that there was this very difficult news coming and knowing what the circumstances were, they feel that the only chance electorally that Conservatives have at the next election is if voters think that this is fair, that the distribution of the pain is fair. And that's why the first thing, and really the only tax change that the Chancellor went into in detail, was that the very wealthy will pay, more of people will pay that top rate of tax. That was very, very deliberate. What he didn't go into detail about was the freezing of the tax thresholds, which we've talked about before. They're called stealth taxes because they sound quite benign. In the end, it means millions more people will pay more tax. There was absolutely no doubt about that. The other side of this, of course, was protection for some, for pensioners and for those on benefits. Again, that's all about the fairness argument for the Conservatives. There was a bit of a rabbit, as you said, the education spending. Not many people were actually thinking about that. But it is important to look at some of that detail and things like the energy package. Yes, there will be a cap for the average household, £3,000 a year on your energy bill, but lots of people will no longer be getting that £400 rebate. So they're going to be paying higher bills without the help. There are going to be millions of people looking at the graphs that the BBC do and everyone else, and knowing that they are going to be hundreds of pounds a year worse off. And the question for Labour, which of these measures will they oppose, if any? We didn't get any sense of that today.
Faisal.
Kind of two budgets in one. There's a budget for after the election, after the spending review, I think the government would say. And that is the consolidation, that's the grim, that's the £55 billion, 2% of GDP. It's the down payment to the markets on credibility. For the future, opposition would argue, well, you've left the problem to us. But before that, far more support, both in terms of government spending and in terms of energy spending. Actually, net giveaway, small giveaway, that's excluding the energy package, next year in terms of supporting the economy. And that's because, as we were saying, the government wants to earn its credibility spurs back with the market so that interest rates are lower, but it's worried about this recession, doesn't want to prolong it, and so there's extra money out there. And it's quite the list. Tax, GDP, it caused a lot of problems for Rishi Sunak when it went up to 70-year high. It's now at the highest level since the Second World War, 37.5%. So it's even higher than the level that caused Mr Sunak all the problems as Chancellor.
Briefly, Simon?
Windfall taxes yielding £55 billion over the next 5 years. That's a big number. They went after the low-carbon electricity generators, that's nuclear, and some older wind projects. That's £4 billion. They think they're going to get 14 billion in total next year, 55 over the period. And also, I'm looking at the financial markets now. They think they're pretty calm, barely moved, so they don't mind what they've heard. I think some of that is to do with the fact that because energy costs have come down, what was going to cost 60 billion, which was the energy support up to the end of March, is now estimated to cost 43 billion. And what was running at 60 billion per every 6 months, it's going to come down to 25 billion from March onwards, because they're going to make it slightly less generous, but with some extra giveaways to people on the lowest income. So financial markets probably like this because actually they're not having to stump up as much money and lend as much money to the government as they previously thought.
John Glenn. welcome to the studio. He's sitting there patiently, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Tough decisions announced today, as Jeremy Hunt has admitted. Do you now accept that much of the substance of those tough decisions are in part necessary because of the economic mismanagement of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng from the mini-budget under that Conservative government in September?
No, I don't. I think mistakes were made, and when the Chancellor came into office, he acknowledged that and he corrected the mistakes of that mini-budget within 3 days. What we're dealing with here is a set of global challenges, particularly inflation. With inflation at 11%, a rate that we haven't seen for 40 years, that gets everywhere. It damages savings. It damages the prospects of growth in the economy. And what we need is stability. We need to get back to growth, and we need to protect those.
But do you accept, people are already struggling and suffering more with higher taxes? We now know they're going to be even higher than people thought. Higher mortgage payments because of those mistakes and the economic mismanagement of a Conservative government.
Well, I think we need to look at the global context.
Well, I know you'd like to look at the global context, but hang on. You have to admit that as a result... but you actually said it wasn't as a result of the mini-budget, but the higher taxes and higher mortgage payments that people are struggling with right now are as a direct consequence, aren't they, of that mini-budget?
No, and that's not what the OBR says. What the OBR says is that the measures we've taken today will reduce the duration and the depth of that recession. What we've put together today is a package of measures that protect our public services and support the most vulnerable in our society, but also, as has been said, gives the markets reassurance that we have got stability in our public finances.
Yeah, markets that were in turmoil as a result of that mini-budget. I mean, Rishi Sunak said that his mandate, his legitimacy as Prime Minister comes from the last general election, from that mandate, the Conservative Party's manifesto in 2019. And that manifesto repeatedly promised to deliver a low-tax economy in order to protect the incomes of hard-working families. Where is your mandate for all these tax rises that have just been announced by Jeremy Hunt?
When we had the general election, we didn't anticipate 4 months later we'd have to shut down the economy overnight because of COVID.
Yeah, but Rishi Sunak has said he still said as Prime Minister that would be his mandate.
Finish, please.
Yeah.
Then subsequently, when we came out of that and borrowed tens of billions, we then had a disruption to the supply of energy, which has largely caused the inflation of unprecedented levels in the last 40 years. Those two factors drive us to different considerations that clearly we couldn't have anticipated when we came into office. So, of course we want, and Conservatives believes in lower taxes, but we've also got to recognise that inflation is the primary concern that we've got to deal with in the short term.
Right, and you are talking, rightly, historically, that 2019 now is a very long time ago. But let's just have a listen and a look at what Rishi Sunak himself promised not that long ago, back in August, in fact, when he was running to be Prime Minister.
I am going to cut taxes. And that's why today I set out a radical set of reforms to cut the basic rate of income tax by a fifth under my leadership. Because as Conservatives, we believe in hard work. I want to reward hard work and allow people to keep more of their hard-earned money. So under me, income taxes will fall, and they will fall at the fastest rate since Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher.
That was in August, John.
Well, I think we can all understand that the impact of inflation and the energy impact in terms of household bills is phenomenal. And that's why the government have acted to give direct support to the most vulnerable. And actually, that needs to be paid for. We've realised that we cannot borrow for unrealistic levels. So we've got today a plan for stability, for growth, and that protection of public services and helping the most vulnerable, uprating benefits, uprating the holding to the triple lock and helping those who can't earn more money, who are pensioners, but actually also supporting people across the economy.
Faisal Islam, Economics Editor. Chief Secretary, inflation was already 9% when Rishi Sunak made that promise, and it's now at 11% and may have peaked. So the difference isn't that much, and he promised to bring down income tax. It rather suggests that something that happened in between those moments was the causal factor for you having to go further, to give almost like a blood sacrifice to the markets. This 50 billion consolidation by 27-28 is a single G7 country announcing kind of emergency budget level consolidation like that?
Well, I think the Chancellor's been very transparent that this hasn't been a set of easy decisions. There has been spread over difficult tax decisions, which he set out for businesses and for individuals, as well as spending considerations. But what he's also...
Your case is that it's all global. This rather suggests if no other G7 countries having to do this, that it's not global. It's domestic. It's only the UK is having to take 2% out of the economy or announce that for the future whilst we're in recession.
The intensification of the pressures on household bills, driven by inflation and driven by the increase in the cost of energy, which is direct result of what Putin's done in Ukraine.
He's already done that. That invasion happened in February.
The impact on the markets was not clear. And when I worked for Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor, we brought in a number of interventions that moved with the understanding of the stress it would bring to the economy. This is a practical response to the situation we find ourselves in.
Vicky? Lots of people watching this will think that you or somebody should apologise for what's happened. But it sounds to me, and it sounded from what Jeremy Hunt was saying, that actually you as a Conservative government are taking no responsibility whatsoever for any of this. Is that the case?
I don't think that's what's been said. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor both said very clearly when they came into office just 4 weeks ago, that they regretted very much what happened. But our job now as government ministers is to put this right, to bring stability, set the conditions for growth, but also recognise that we have an obligation and a duty to look after the most vulnerable in our society compassionately, and that's what the measures today set out.
The windfall tax is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. Something that the previous Prime Minister said that they weren't ideologically not in favour of windfall taxes. You've basically just taken Labour Party policy and replicated it.
No, I don't accept that, but come on.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, if anything, you've got a little bit further than Labour would have done in the first instance. But what people in business tell me is that if your ultimate aim is to bring debt as a percentage of GDP down over the period, then don't forget about the growth bit. And what there isn't in here is much, anything to stop businesses hibernating this winter and beyond. There are no additional tax incentives to invest. The super deduction runs out in March next year with no replacement for it. You've given up on growth.
Well, I don't think that's true either. I mean, if I just address the tax on energy companies, what we're always keen to do is preserve the imperative of investment beyond the cycle. Wide cycles in energy companies, I think we do that. And we brought in the electricity generators as well because they're enjoying profits that are extreme and beyond anything that can be related to that cycle. We've also protected the R&D budget. We've also protected small businesses in particular from business rate changes. We recognise that these are difficult challenges, but even with the corporation tax increase, 70% of businesses won't pay that increased rate of 25%. They'll stay on the 19%.
Because they're not making any profit?
Well, because they're making profits that are less than 50,000. But what we've tried to do is say, well, where are we globally? That 25% rate on corporation tax, for example, is competitive, the most competitive in G7. So I'm not pretending that these are easy decisions, but it is a balanced package. I was the city minister for 4.5 years, and one thing I do know is that we need to have stability in the markets. You've acknowledged that the reaction to the statement by the Chancellor today has broadly welcomed it, and I think that that is what the country needs, is a degree of stability at this time.
You say it's a balanced budget. I just want to return to the issue of the tax rises and the manifesto commitments that were made by the Conservative government in 2019. Yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, the Conservative MP Esther McVey said that she wouldn't agree to higher taxes. She implied that if the Tories aren't about lower taxation, then what is the point? She used HS2 as an example. What would you say to her and colleagues who agree with her?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the instinct for lower taxes. But what I have got to say to her is that we are going through a set of challenges to the economy that have resulted in an inflation rate which is hurting many people very badly, particularly the most vulnerable. And as the government of the day, we've got to take steps to look after those people. We've done that with the uprating of benefits. We've done that with special payments for this year and next year. That costs quite a lot of money. And in order to pay for that, we've got to get that balance right between borrowing and tax.
Isn't the reality that you've kicked the toughest decisions to after the next election and on current polling to the opposition, to the Labour Party?
Our primary focus has to be, obviously, the next 2 years and dealing with the immediate pressure of record inflation rates. But if you look at the profile of spending thereafter and you relate it back to what we saw in 2010 or 2015, you'll see that those changes are much, much less. So we are keeping a commitment to the capital budget. It was 50 billion in 2010. It's 115 billion next year.
And as Chief Sec, public sector workers will look at pensioners and they will look at benefit recipients getting 10%. How can you look them in the eye, a nurse that we were clapping in the pandemic, a school teacher, and say you can only have 3 or 4% when inflation is now at 11%?
Well, the extra 8 billion given to the NHS, 3.3, and 4.7 billion to social care.
That's for wages, is it?
Well, they all feed into the pay board reviews, which, as you know, happen every spring. And obviously that takes account of lots of representations, and we have generally observed the outcomes of those pay review decisions.
This means higher wages for public sector workers?
Well, as you know,
You're the Chief Secretary, this is your remit.
Yeah, but you also know that there is a deliberate process with each pay review body. There are inputs given by government, and obviously the total budgets of the NHS. Yeah, Amanda Pritchard has welcomed what we've done today for the NHS. She has welcomed it and says we're serious about fixing the challenges that they face, which are mostly from the COVID background.
And yet there'll still be strikes probably going ahead by nurses.
Well, I sincerely hope not. I do value, obviously, what nurses have done. They're under a lot of strain, and that's why the Chancellor has put in the extra money today.
All right. John Glenn, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thank you very much for joining us. It's interesting, Vicki, John Glenn saying to colleagues like Esther McVey and others within the party that I'm afraid we just can't achieve the ambitions that we would like to, the instinct of being a low or lower tax economy. Just to show people tax as a percentage of GDP, if we can see here on the graph, this is not taking in today's figures. It was 36.3%. It's now gone up to 37.5%. That's quite a sizable increase. Now, people would say you can look at other European countries, comparable European countries, and say their taxes are higher, but the argument might be the public services are better.
Yeah, I mean, I think people like Esther McVey and others were unhappy before, as you say, with the tax burden where it was, and they're going to be even more unhappy now. The big question is, how far are they willing to take it in terms of when it comes to a vote, if it comes to a vote at some point, of course, next year, will they oppose these changes? Now, I think since the turmoil, really, of Liz Truss's leadership, things have calmed down in terms of rebellions and all the rest of it. But, you know, they will be looking at this and thinking this is not why we became Conservatives. And it's whether they buy the argument that actually this needs to happen, and it needs to happen because people want public services to be funded.
Let's welcome Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who always joins us pretty well on these occasions. Welcome to you. Your first impressions and response to what you heard from Jeremy Hunt.
An awful lot going on here. In some ways, it'll be quite a relief, I think, for a lot of people, because there's not really spending cuts over the next couple of years, as was somewhat trailed, either for benefits or for public services, and limited tax rises in the short run, mostly on those with higher incomes. What the Chancellor has done, though, is pencil in some really tough spending periods after the next election. So we wait to see whether those really happen. Two other things it's worth saying. One is that his fiscal problem is driven overwhelmingly by what he's having to pay on debt interest. I mean, that's what's really changed since March, since the last time we got the OBR numbers. Debt interest payments are going to reach close to record levels, and that is a very clear indication of the problems that you get when you've got high debt, high borrowing, high inflation, and the Bank of England holding a lot of that debt. The second thing I'd say is, if you look at the OBR numbers, we've got the worst 2 years, in their view, for living standards pretty much in history. A really big drop they are forecasting in household incomes.
Right, and that is going to be very tough with people already facing higher energy bills, even with some of the help from the government and rising prices, of course, on things like weekly shop. We were expecting a freeze in income tax thresholds, and we got it. In terms of people's salaries and the amount they're paying, even though they are called so-called stealth taxes, people are going to be paying more tax, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, in terms of the next 2 or 3 years, that was all announced back in 2021, but because inflation's so much higher, it's a much bigger tax rise. In fact, the amount additional raised in the last couple of years is very small, because inflation is expected to be lower, and the OBR actually has inflation going negative at one point, I think in 2024 or 2025, which is pretty remarkable if we see it, because, of course, you get, hopefully, these increases in energy and food prices dropping out and indeed falling.
In terms of the public pressure then on services, you said that actually there aren't going to be the cuts that perhaps we might have expected in the next 2 years, but inflation is still running high. There are already ongoing squeezes on frontline services, even if this extra cash is going into education and health. Some departments are going to really struggle, though, over the next few years.
Yeah, and the big struggle is going to be, as you were just discussing, on wages. I mean, all of these assumptions on spending was set a bit more than a year ago, when we expected inflation to be, 3, maybe 4%, and to give public sector workers anything close to wages that match inflation is going to be really hard, knocking on for impossible within the kinds of budgets that have been set. So I think that it remains the case. The hardest set of decisions this government's going to have to make over the next year are going to be on public sector pay. We've seen teachers and nurses and others balloting for strike action recently, and it looks like next year they'll get yet again well below inflation pay rises.
And the differences between private sector and public sector at this point?
Well, on pay, we've seen public sector do worse than the private sector for the last 10 years. They're doing worse than the private sector at the moment. It is worth saying that their pensions remain massively more generous than anything in the public in the private sector. If I was the government, I would be looking at trying to rebalance that, because actually a lot of public sector workers need that money now.
Right. And in terms, just briefly to go back to the mini budget, we were talking to John Glenn about how much he should apologise for what they called the mistakes made. Has today's announcements by Jeremy Hunt rectified, as he would see it, those mistakes?
Well, of course, it's a few weeks ago now that Jeremy Hunt undid nearly everything that was in the mini budget. I was actually slightly disappointed to see that he today undid the stamp duty reduction, and that was the one good part of the entire mini budget, a relatively small tax cut, and one that was actually very much needed, because it's a dreadful, damaging tax, stamp duty. I think what we got today was, so what we've had over the last couple of months since the mini budget has been a winding back from that, a very big difference in tone, actually not a very big tightening next year in the way that I think the Treasury the Chancellor was thinking about. They might think they're taking a little bit of a risk with the markets, but I think they're probably right in judging that this change in tone, the clear sense of a fiscal plan, will be enough to keep a cap on where interest rates are going. But as we see, so important for them. It is this big increase in interest rates, not just to do with the mini budget. That's what's driving nearly all of the problems they've got.
So
I'm just looking at the markets here, and they're beginning. The cost of borrowing for 10 years for the government is beginning to inch up, potentially because a lot of this is backloaded. And as you say, there was no, if you like, down payment before the election on fiscal rectitude. And it does seem also that, just going back to your point, Joe, that what traders were openly calling the moron premium of what happened in the Liz Truss budget,
charmingly,
has pretty much been eliminated, mostly, so that the markets are prepared to give a chance. But there are some. What struck me, Paul, was that there were some pretty heroic growth assumptions in the OBR forecast of 2.7% by the end. And I've just received a text from one business leader who says, off the record, I don't see that wafer-thin growth plan ever getting to 2.7% growth, and there's been nothing in labour market or investment incentives.
Well, I think partly what the OBR is, the way their models work is that there is a sort of, there is a potential for growth in the economy, and because we've got such terrible growth, indeed recession, over the next year or two, there's space to grow after that. It's also really important to note that what is their growth based on over those years? Higher immigration, going along with lower productivity. So the growth is actually coming not from a big spurt in productivity, it's coming from a higher population, and actually they still have pretty miserable productivity numbers in there.
Paul Johnson, thank you very much for joining us from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I said that we would return to Gloucester, and we're going to do precisely that and join our reporter again, Adina Campbell, who's got people sitting with her there and reacting to what they've heard in that autumn statement. Adina.
Yes, well, people here in Gloucester, like so many others right across the country, have been talking to us about how they've been dealing with bigger bills during such a tough economic time. This is the Eastgate Indoor Market in the heart of Gloucester city centre. And all day we've been hearing from business owners, shoppers, public sector workers getting reaction to what was announced in that autumn statement a short time ago. Let's speak to Kim Redding. Now, you run a craft store just beside us here.
Yes.
From what you've seen in the budget, the announcements today, what do you make of them?
Well, I mean, it's good that the minimum wage is going up, but then that's going to mean that everybody's still going to pay more national insurance, more tax. So I think long term, we won't be any better off.
And it's been a tough time.
And it's still very, very, very tough. I mean, every day is really, really hard work getting people to come in to spend money because they're all really, really struggling to pay all the main heating bills and things. That's the key thing. They've got to pay their bills.
And how are you managing?
I'm lucky. I have a part-time job as well as doing this and a small pension, but I still struggle.
And Ian, you're a postal worker. You're in touch with your local members. Obviously, you're going through strike action at the moment, and you're hearing so much from your members at the moment because there's still pressure on the public sector, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And with mortgages still going sky high, and there didn't seem to be anything in the budget today that's going to help anyone who's earning a wage. There's nothing there that's going to make them feel any better about themselves. So we're still in the middle of a dispute with Royal Mail, who are still pushing the finger and still announcing that there's going to be 10,000 job losses over the next few months within Royal Mail. So the uncertainty is even worse for our members in the CWU. So today is not told us anything that's going to put a smile on our face. In fact, it's just another kick in the teeth as far as we can see.
So as far as you're concerned, you haven't been encouraged by any of the announcements?
Of course, it's good that some people's been given a little bit more money. We're not trying to take it away from anyone. We're trying to get what we deserve, and in a fair way. There's nothing wrong with the triple lock being guaranteed. I think that's a great thing. I think pensioners have paid in for such a long time, they should get their money. What we're asking for is some fairness. We're talking of CEOs who's taking millions and millions of pounds out of our industry every year, and going from a company that's earning £800 million a year to then saying they're losing £1 million a day within 6 months. There's something wrong here. There's something seriously wrong with the way the business is being managed, and we get imposed a 2% pay rise. And that's why we're out on strike, and we will be out on strike on Good Friday, and we will be out on strike on Cyber Monday as well, to put as much pressure as we can on for our CEO, Simon Thompson, to make a deal. We need a deal with the CWU, so we got the security going forward, especially since there's nothing in the budget for us either.
Neil, let's come to you because you run a store here in this indoor market, an antiques and shoe store. Have you been encouraged? What do you make of the announcements today?
I don't think he's done anything at all to help the economy. He's giving the people on the lowest wage grains of sand in an ocean. Nothing. It's not making a difference to their cost of living. It's totally disproportional.
And really
it's totally a joke.
Really?
That's what I think. And they've done nothing to stimulate the economy or the diminishing work ethic in our population.
What were you hoping to hear today?
Something positive.
And you've not got that?
There's nothing.
And how much longer do you think that you can? How much longer do you think that you could go on for?
Just a few months at the best.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Well, the people here in Gloucester, they are going to be keeping a close eye on how these announcements could have an effect on their futures. But chances are they're going to see their budget squeezed and the way they actually continue to run their businesses squeezed even more so over the coming months.
Thank you very much, Adina Campbell. They're sorry that the picture there froze a little bit throughout those interviews, but I think you could hear everything that was being said. Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who was with us earlier, was referencing the fact that many of the decisions that were made by Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, today were driven by higher borrowing costs for the government. Let's just show you the borrowing forecasts now, because, of course, we have those figures. Remember, we didn't have the Office for Budget Responsibility, who are required to give these sorts of forecasts that they do a couple of times a year. But now you can see £177 billion this year and next. dropping to 140 billion, and then you can see the figures as you go through, 69.2 billion pounds by 2027-28. What do you make of those figures, Faisal?
Well, that chart is, I haven't done the numbers, it's hundreds of billions more than the previous March 2020. Just as a little bit of a addendum, it's staggering to imagine what that would have been were it not for the reversals. And to think, as we revealed, that the OBR gave some numbers to the previous Chancellor on their first day in office, and I can't see how it would have been much different, and they carried on pursuing that policy. That is quite something. I mean, I'd be surprised if there wasn't an inquiry into it, frankly, because it was, you know, to end up with this after you reversed all the measures. What did that look like before the measures? Park that. Interest rate costs, as Paul Johnson just said, £120 billion. Now, that's getting on, not quite, to the NHS budgets, way above the schools budget this year, and it stays around 100 billion, more or less, for the entire period, the interest rate cost. I mean, that is huge, and that's exactly what Paul Johnson was referring. Another little nugget, which I think is quite interesting, we talked about the threshold increases. Now, the OBR say that as a result of this freeze in the threshold, ordinarily you'd expect that to go up with inflation. We're going to get 3 million more people joining the tax system, and on top of that, 2.6 million more higher rate taxpayers. And so I think that takes it to about 8 million higher rate taxpayers. 1990, there was 1.7 million. And it's something like a quarter of taxpayers will be higher rate taxpayers. And so that's really quite a significant change. Will they lose their child benefit, you know, which is the current policy?
But it is taking a lot more people into higher rates of
who
tax.
won't consider themselves rich, even though they're above average.
Let's welcome Pat McFadden, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury for the Labour Party. Pat, you will have heard Jeremy Hunt say that the Office for Budget Responsibility blames the high rates of inflation mainly on global headwinds. Do you agree with that, that it is down to the war in Ukraine that has led to higher energy prices in the main, not entirely, and that has led to the very high rate of inflation?
There are definitely global factors,
right.
And no one's disputing that. But there are two other very important things that led to today's statement. The first and most obvious, of course, was the mini-budget. It crashed the economy. And,
we did that with John Glenn.
Mortgage rates rising and so on. But the other is Britain's longer-term poor growth performance. We are the only G7 country not to recover our economic position from COVID. So it's not just about the 12 weeks since or however many it is, since the mini-budget. It's about a much longer pattern of years of anemic growth. So, of course, there are international factors, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the impact that's had on energy prices and inflation and so on. But this country's been more exposed to the global factors because of those other two things.
Which part of the budget, or the autumn statement, I should say, did you not really agree with? Because you agree with uprating pensions and uprating benefits, with prices at 10.1%. You agree with the energy price guarantee intervention. You initially said it should only go to April. Well, it is actually going to be extended much further, and there'll be targeted help for the poorest. There's extra cash going to education and to the NHS, all of which you agree with.
And windfall taxes.
And windfall taxes.
Well, as Simon says, some of these things we suggest.
Absolutely. So you agree with all of this?
In the teeth of government opposition. Look, these things, he spoke for an hour. There's an awful lot of measures.
Yes.
You know, I've been around politics for quite a long time, and one of the things I've learned is that when you get a budget which has got however many dozen measures in it, the best thing to do is digest it for a couple of days before pronouncing on each and every one.
But you don't disagree with any of those. And the windfall tax, as Simon quite rightly said, you suggested they've, to some extent, taken it on.
Look, you know, they have to some extent, though we think there are still loopholes in it, which has left some money on the table.
Well, but look, it's going to raise £14 billion, according to Jeremy Hunt.
The minimum wage was a Labour policy.
So they've taken your statement and budget, and they've left you with nowhere to go.
Well, no, I don't think that, because you know we can come back to what might happen in 2 years. But in some instances, they have picked up policies in the 180-degree turn that they've tried to institute since September. But what they can't get away from, and this is an important point, is just pretending that the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng budget was a sort of bad dream, because they can't escape from the anemic growth position, which means that this country is having an emergency budget like this, but a lot of our competitors
But you didn't, at the time of the mini-budget, oppose that much of it.
Rishi Sunak did. I mean, that's the irony, isn't it? Rishi Sunak, who's now Prime Minister, during the leadership contest, he stood up and said very clearly that the measures that Liz Truss was outlining, the tax cuts, were immoral, that they would wreck the economy. Labour was quiet. In fact, Labour agreed with much of that. But it's true, you did not stand up in the way Rishi Sunak did.
Wait a minute. I recall doing lots of interviews the day that budget took place, talking about the huge risk that...
But I'm talking about during the actual contest, when we knew what they were going to, what she was going to do.
With the public finances. We said it was a huge risk with the public finances, and we were right about that.
Right. I mean, it's difficult for people to think, what would Labour do now so radically differently? Even when you digest all of the measures, and I grant you, there are an awful lot of them, but whether it's on the tax side, you'd agree broadly that the wealthiest should pay more, and they are going to be paying more.
Well,
you would agree that targeted help would come through, and that pensioners and people on benefits will be helped the most. So in principle, there's nothing to choose between you.
They still haven't done non-DOMs, a gaping hole in this that we've been...
How much does that raise, Pat McFadden?
Come back to how much it raises. They haven't done private equity managers, who in some ways are paying, as a proportion of their income, less tax than the people who probably come in and work in the canteen. As I said, there's loopholes in the windfall tax. There are different choices to be made.
But they wouldn't call it a loophole. They would say the fact that you can offset investment against the fact of what you pay, that is not a loophole. They would call that a deliberate feature, because they want people to invest more in the UK over the next couple of years.
This has left some of the biggest oil companies in the world paying nothing.
It's true, Shell paid nothing this year.
Because they are, in effect, being given money back for things that we're going to do anyway.
Right, but can we come back? Let's do the figure for the non-DOMs, because it would raise about £3 billion a year, wouldn't it? £3 billion a year. When you look at some of the announcements today and what we were talking about, the black hole in the public finances, yes, £3 billion a year is a significant amount. It's not as big as some of the other measures that have been taken. Again, what will distinguish you in 2 years' time, when that election happens in 2024? You are going to inherit an awful lot of what was announced today, and particularly some of the spending consolidation that goes beyond 2024. You will have to embrace austerity.
Well, let's look at 2 years' time. One of the things that the country's learned in the past couple of months is what happens if you have no regard to financial stability. We saw that in the market reaction to the mini-budget and everything that happened, the Emergency Bank of England interventions and so on. And that's why we've been keen to say that when we announce a policy, we'll say how we're going to pay for it. So we will put financial stability first. And it may be, that because of the economic circumstances that have now been created after these year after year of low economic growth are more difficult than we would want to inherit. You inherit the situation you do inherit. And I want to say to the British public, you've just seen what happens when you go for a quick fix sugar rush, and the reaction that had and what it did to mortgage rates. You're not going to get a mirror image of that from us. We're going to be responsible with the public finances. Well, and where we say we want to pay for something or do something, we'll say how we pay for it.
So let's pin this down now. Do you accept the OBR numbers, Jeremy Hunt's numbers, as the baseline for your manifesto? A 2% consolidation of £54 billion.
We accept them today. But remember, the election...
So you accept Tory austerity then?
We said after the mini-budget that one of the mistakes was ignoring the OBR. We're not about to repeat that mistake.
Well, there's a big debate about whether this is actually... whether there is a black hole or not.
This is not the last OBR before the election. There will be other budgets, other financial statements. Let's see what happens over the next couple of years. But we haven't turned up today to do what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did and just ignore what the OBR says.
So you've turned up to accept the 50 billion consolidation?
We accept what the OBR says today.
So you can't turn around to the teachers and the doctors and the nurses and give them an inflation pay rise because you have the same fiscal constraints?
My message to everybody is that we will put financial stability first, but let's see what happens in the next couple of years, because this isn't the final OBR report. There are 2 a year, and as you know, probably far better than me, often the forecasts that they make and the predictions that they make can change quite a lot over 6 months. So let us see what happens. But we accept the OBR and we think it's an important part of the economic architecture.
And the Labour left have signed up to that?
I'm here to speak for the front bench and the Treasury team.
It does sound like you might go into the election, as happened when Tony Blair came in, saying that we accept what you have already planned, you, the Conservative government. Well, look, and you were around in those days.
A lot of this was backloaded, to use the phrase, in what Jeremy Hunt announced today. And I think one of the reasons he did that is he wants to wait and see what happens over the next 2 years too. So there will be more budget statements between now and then. There'll be more OBR reports. But I do want to be clear with you, if we inherit a more difficult situation than we would have hoped for if we are elected, as Keir Starmer himself has said in his conference speech a couple of months ago, there may be things we want to do, good Labour things, that take longer than we would like.
Soft peddling, 50 billion consolidation, though, isn't it? It's not, you can't, I mean, that's a lot of stuff you can't do. That's maybe most of the stuff that you...
Well, where we say we want to do...
You don't have to accept the 50 billion. You could say, we'll balance the books over 7, 8 or 9 years. And you're expressly saying no to that.
You can push the target, you know, as far back into the future. But I think there comes a point where how meaningful is the target, depending...
But you've rejected that approach. You've rejected saying, actually, we don't want to have the same target. You have the same target as Jeremy Hunt. Let's be clear, and the same numbers. And you're taking those into the next election. I
can't say we're taking them into the next election because this isn't the last OBR before the election. This is their view of the situation today. It's a radically different view from their last report in March. If the election's in 2 years' time, there may be how many more? 3, 4 more OBR reports between now and then. Let us see what happens, but we will put financial stability first.
Pat McFadden, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thank you very much for joining us. When we were all sat here at the end of September, the 23rd of September for the mini-budget, we spoke to Jane Foley from Rabobank. She said then that her clients were panicking to some extent as to what they saw in terms of market reaction. Jane joins us now. What's the reaction today, Jane?
Well, thankfully, it's far more boring, which is, of course, what the Chancellor had expected or had tried to achieve. And we had a series, of course, of reports over the last few weeks as to what those fiscal austerity measures would be, and that the size of that fiscal black hole at 50 billion, well within the realms of what we had been fed in the last few weeks. Now, in terms of the market reaction today, well, what we have is gilts selling off just moderately, just by a fairly small amount. The market pricing in just a little bit more in terms of an interest rate hike from the Bank of England than they were this morning, but just over 50 basis points, half of 1% from the bank. And that's probably because, of course, a lot of the austerity measures have been backloaded to the end of this fiscal period, and that means that they won't be hitting soon, which probably leaves the Bank of England a little bit more work to do in terms of bringing down inflation through monetary policy, because fiscal policy perhaps won't be pulling quite as hard. But it is really, compared with September, a far calmer market reaction.
Yes, you say boring compared to the end of September. But as you say, some of the pain, if you like, has been pushed a little bit into the future. Do you think the markets broadly have been calm to the extent that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak were hoping?
Well, probably. I mean, sterling is a little bit lower from the announcement. That perhaps will be a little bit of a disappointment to them. But, of course, we've had a lot of dollar weakness recently, and that's brought up the price of sterling against the US dollar. So it looks a lot better than it did just a couple of weeks ago. So the weakness of sterling today, it hasn't been huge, but it is there. That's probably a disappointment, but that probably reflects just the rottenness, really, the sourness of UK fundamentals. We know from the OBR, that the recession in their forecast is here already.
Yeah.
Their forecast for recession more or less in line with what the Bank of England has predicted. So no huge shocks here, but still a very gloomy outlook and a very difficult situation in terms of the cost of living crisis for the UK economy.
Jane Foley, thank you very much. Picking up on that final point, Vicki, the fundamentals in the UK economy, certainly from Jane Foley's perspective, they're still very weak, they're still very gloomy. There will be a sense of how long the recession will last. Jeremy Hunt very much hoping it will be shorter than perhaps we initially thought and not as deep, because then politically this government will be in very big trouble.
Yeah, because if they can turn around in a couple of years and say, actually, the measures that we took meant that the recession was shallower, then they can say that they have made a difference, I suppose.
Although the counterintuitive is always very difficult, the counterfactual, I should say, is always very difficult, isn't it, if people are still feeling that pain?
Yeah, and I think the problem is that looking at this, the really overwhelming figure that's coming at you there is this enormous drop in living standards, which is going to go on for some time. And that is something that no politician can gloss over, because people are going to feel it every single day between now and the general election. I think what they're doing, and you can hear it from Pat McFadden, and I'm sure the government is the same, they are slightly crossing their fingers and hoping that actually the war, we all hope, will end. Energy prices might drop.
Well, the price of wholesale gas has come down to some extent. Inflation might come down. So it is. Is that the strategy? Well, cross your fingers.
It was actually more interesting than that they normally getting inflation down is the Bank of England's job. What you saw rhetorically a couple of times there from the Chancellor was him saying, well, it's also my job, actually, which is not necessarily the case. And what we're seeing here, I think, is, lo and behold, when it does come down, partly because of gas prices
He'll say it's down to him.
It's down to us because it's forecast to come down to, as you have,
7.
Maybe
this idea that it's going to be, below that.
Yes.
This seems...
Well, this is quite important because when the energy prices drop out of the inflation figure, it quite quickly goes into reverse.
So then do you need to do these measures in the way that you are? If the
well, you do because of the interest rate hole in the public finances.
And perhaps the market reaction.
We'll probably be here in a year's time and inflation will be 0 or -1, as it was in the OBR. But that doesn't mean that chunk of money that people spend on their energy bills, there is a step change which will mean a permanent impairment of people's disposable income. A couple of other tiny things in there. The capital gains allowance came way down from 12,000 to 9,000 to 12,000 to 6,000 to 3,000. I think some backbenchers will say that's not a particularly Tory thing to do. And also in there's an assumption that house prices will fall 9%. So those are some of the extra details in there which the OBR is modelling out there. And I think overall business will say...
Council tax, Joe, we did say during it, he didn't really mention that, but as we thought, it is going to allow councils to put up council tax rates in without the referendum.
Which is at about 2.99%, so it could go up as high as, I don't know what the cap is, 5%. Potentially. If you want to learn more about the economy and the statement, go over to BBC Sounds, where you can find Understand the Economy. This is a BBC Politics Live special covering the statement, the economic statement from Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, and the response from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. Let's now get reaction from the SNP, from Richard Thompson, the economic spokesman for the SNP in Westminster. Welcome to you. First of all, your response to what you heard from Jeremy Hunt.
Well, I think my response is one overwhelmingly of disappointment. I think that anybody who woke up this morning worried about how they were going to pay their bills and find their way through the cost of living crisis over the next few months and years ahead, it will still be left wondering that, because the fundamental fact of this is that for all the increases in spending in cash terms that were announced by the Chancellor today, they're being eclipsed by the inflation rate that's hit an 11.1%, a 41-year high today, it's been announced. So the purchasing power of any extra money that the Chancellor is announcing is being more than eroded by that state with inflation.
Now, you say disappointment, Richard, but you will have heard Jeremy Hunt announce an extension, a continuation of support in terms of the energy price guarantee, albeit, yes, a little bit higher, but it is going to continue for another year, and then targeted support for people who are on means-tested benefits, for pensioners and to those on disability. Presumably you welcome that.
Well, it's better than if it wasn't happening at all, but it's still only a a mitigation, a partial mitigation of the increased costs that people are facing.
As a result of global headwinds, we heard from Jeremy Hunt there, those global headwinds, the Office for Budget Responsibility agrees that that is the main root cause of the high inflation.
It's not the only cause of
No,
it, though, and there are a few
the main.
self-inflicted wounds like the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng
Yes, but they've unwound.
budget. But
they've
also,
unwound pretty well all of that.
And also Brexit certainly isn't diminishing those headwinds. So, you know, let's not let the government entirely off the hook that this is entirely down to global factors. But in terms of who picks up the bill for this, the Chancellor's aim was, or his words sadly didn't match up to the actions, because there were a number of measures that three measures he could have taken which would have placed the burden of the taxation onto the broadest shoulders. One of those would have been expanding the windfall tax, so it wasn't just about oil, gas and energy companies and expanding it to big retailers like Amazon.
They have expanded it quite significantly, haven't they, Richard Thompson? They are going to be bringing in the region of £14 billion.
Well, they could have done that. They could also have taxed non-DOMs. That might not have made them very popular with his next-door neighbour.
And that would have raised about £3.2 billion.
That would have raised the £3.2 billion, which isn't currently being raised. And they could also, if they taxed share buybacks, that could have raised approximately another £11 billion. So in a £55 billion consolidation package, as it was being put, split 50-50 between spending cuts and increased taxes, straight away, even just with the last two measures I've mentioned, that's the core of about £15 billion that could have been raised without having to increase the tax burden on some of the people who are least able to afford that.
Right, but the consensus, if you remember, the mini-budget that you talked about earlier from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the increased amount in borrowing, much of it unfunded tax cuts as the markets viewed it, but the largest amount fiscally was the energy intervention, the energy price guarantee. Rishi Sunak said that the plans to increase borrowing were risky and even immoral. The SNP, you, on the other hand, said Liz Truss wasn't borrowing enough. Your leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford, said that Liz Truss's plan to cap energy bills fell far short of the help we need, even though it was probably, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, one of the most expensive policies in modern political history.
Well, the borrowing in and of itself needn't necessarily have been a problem. It was the fact that there was no clear plan for how that was going to be consolidated through the tax base. That was what gave the fright to the markets, and that's the price that we're still paying through interest rates that are higher than they would otherwise be, which also means that any of the spending increases in cash terms rather than real terms announced by the Chancellor simply aren't going nearly as far as they need to go. But in terms of spreading that burden, there's a couple of measures there in terms of the share buybacks, taxing and tackling non-DOMs would have spread that burden far more equitably. But of course, it is that the energy costs that are building much of the inflation that's there. It's increasing costs for businesses. It's driving through into the costs for food and drink. And that is what's really hammering families at the lowest end of the income scales there. And that's why much more needed to be done today in order to put money in people's pockets and to spread the burden equitably. Sadly, that is not what happened.
Richard Thompson, thank you very much. We're going to speak to Daisy Cooper in just a moment, the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. Let me just bring you this news. This is criticism from the former Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's criticised the substantial tax rises contained within the autumn statement. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say.
We are basing what we're doing on a forecaster who has a very bad track record. And that means that we are, I think, taking decisions that I would prefer us not to be taking. So I'm particularly concerned about the tax rises. When an economy is going into recession, you would normally expect there to be some fiscal support of an economy in recession, whilst you have to have high interest rates to deal with the inflationary problem that the ABR and the Bank of England failed to spot a year ago.
Well, there, Jacob Rees-Mogg, very clear that he doesn't like the tax rises. Vicki, yes,
says he will vote for them.
Well, indeed. We don't know about estimate vote. It sounded like she probably wouldn't. Another Conservative
big thing
MP.
for the government. There will be lots of criticism. How far are they prepared to go against what?
It's a warning shot across the bows, isn't it? Yeah. Let's catch up with Daisy Cooper, who's standing in Central Lobby. Hello to you. Hello. In terms of the big picture announcements, extra cash for education, extra cash for the NHS, pensions and benefits being uprated in line with inflation. Are you in support?
Look, this is a cost of chaos
budget, and it's leaving every single person in this country to pay the price through higher taxes and weaker public services. The OBR has already confirmed that not only are we in recession, not only are we going to have the slowest rate of growth of all similar countries, but the British people, struggling families, are now going to face the biggest fall in living standards ever on record. I think that is a damning indictment of the Conservatives' incompetence.
Right. I mean, Daisy, what decisions, what other choices would the Liberal Democrats have taken?
Well, the Liberal Democrats have said there should be a proper windfall tax. We've been calling for that for more than a year.
Well, and it has been extended quite significantly, hasn't it?
No, look, the Tories' windfall tax is so pathetically weak that a company like Shell, that has made £26 billion in global profits, has not paid a single penny into the Treasury. You can increase the rates all you like, but if you don't close the loophole, you're not going to get any money from them.
Ed Davey, your leader, described Liz Truss's administration as probably the most right-wing government in modern history. Would you still say that under Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think the nicest thing we can say about them is they're not as bad as the last lot, but that bar is incredibly low. I think what we can see today, though, is that their budget, as I say, it is the price of Tory incompetence and chaos. Families are going to really, really struggle. They're going to see their taxes go up and their services get weaker.
Daisy Cooper, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much for joining us. And that brings us to the end of this special programme covering the Chancellor's autumn statement. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. But thank you to all of my guests for joining me here yet again in the studio for another big programme here from Westminster. Bye-bye.